Imagine a world where the fate of nations rests not on battlefields or in grand palaces alone, but in quiet, shadowed rooms where a handful of people speak in hushed voices. Picture a single conversation so powerful it could redefine an entire religion, redirect the flow of empires, or reshape the beliefs of millions for 1,000 years. That is the world we are stepping into today, the world of medieval council meetings, where whispers in candlelit chambers truly did alter the course of human history. These were not dry administrative gatherings or routine bureaucratic events. They were epicenters of transformation, where tension hung thick in the air and every word spoken carried the weight of centuries to come. Think about the decisions made in these rooms. A debate over a single word could determine whether a faith remained united or splintered into factions. A vote among bishops and nobles could set in motion wars, crusades, or golden ages of culture. What's even more fascinating is how these moments, often overlooked in broad histories, ripple unmistakably into our modern lives, from the laws we live under to the beliefs many still hold sacred. We often imagine history as a story of great leaders and dramatic events, yet some of the most pivotal turning points unfolded in meetings where the real drama was in the dialogue, the persuasion, the nuanced alliances formed over theological fine points or royal succession crises. In this video, we'll explore 27 of these extraordinary councils. We'll travel from the ancient Roman Empire to the thresholds of the Renaissance, from the heart of Europe to the edges of the known world, uncovering how these gatherings forged alliances, sparked conflicts, and quietly built the foundations of modern civilization. You'll see how a discussion about something as specific as the date of Easter or the nature of divinity could redirect the destiny of nations, and why these medieval meetings remain deeply relevant today. So settle in, open your imagination, and prepare to listen in on the conversations that shaped our world. You're about to discover that sometimes the most profound changes begin not with a roar, but with a debate. But to truly grasp the gravity of these meetings, we first need to step inside one of these chambers and understand the very particular world of medieval power and protocol. This wasn't like a modern parliament or a corporate board meeting. The stakes were cosmic, the authority was divine, and the rules of engagement were dictated by a complex dance between the sacred and the secular. Imagine a room where a king, his crown glittering in the torchlight, sat beside a cardinal in deep crimson robes, both aware that their decisions would be measured not just in political gains, but against the eternal judgment of heaven. This fusion of spiritual and temporal power created a unique and often explosive dynamic. A bishop, backed by the authority of the church, could openly challenge an emperor, and a nobleman representing ancient familial lands could defy a pope. Their power came from different sources, one from God, the other from blood and soil, and when those sources clashed in a council, the sparks could ignite continents. The variety of these councils was immense. On one end of the spectrum were the massive ecumenical councils, called by popes or emperors to settle foundational questions of church doctrine that had fractured the faithful. These were the summits of theological debate, drawing church fathers from across the known world. On the other end were royal curias, more intimate gatherings of a king's closest advisors, powerful barons, trusted bishops, and legal scholars, convened to decide urgent matters of state, taxes, war, succession, and law. And then there was everything in between: provincial synods, legatine councils, imperial diets. Each type had its own purpose, its own guest list, and its own profound consequences. Regardless of its type, the protocol was anything but casual. Seating arrangements were a meticulously choreographed display of hierarchy. who sat closest to the king or the papal legate was a clear signal of influence and status, and disputes over precedence could derail proceedings before they even began. Agendas were prepared with painstaking care, often circulated in advance, but just as often, the real decisions were forged in backroom deals long before the formal session opened. Promises were made, alliances sealed, and votes secured in quiet cloisters and private chambers over cups of wine. Yet, for all this stage management, these meetings were never fully predictable. A brilliantly delivered speech, a shocking accusation, or a sudden shift in allegiance could turn the tide in an instant. Heated debates over a single word in a creed could erupt into shouting matches, with factions forming and reforming in real time. The outcome might hinge on one man's charisma, another's piety, or a third's cunning political maneuver. It was this volatile combination of rigid structure and passionate, unpredictable human drama that made these councils such potent crucibles of history. Understanding this world of sacred power, strict protocol, and raw human ambition is the key to appreciating just how a single meeting could change everything. Now, let's step into one of those very rooms, a place where the air must have crackled with tension and conviction. The year is 325, and the Roman Empire, under its first Christian emperor, Constantine, is at a crossroads. Christianity has moved from the catacombs to the corridors of power, but this newfound acceptance comes with a price: internal division. A profound and disruptive question is tearing the early church apart. Is Jesus Christ truly divine, of the same essence as God the Father, or is he a created being, the highest of all creations but still subordinate? This wasn't just abstract theology. It was a debate that struck at the very heart of Christian identity and worship. Into this maelstrom of competing ideas stepped Emperor Constantine. Fresh from uniting the empire under his sole rule, he now sought to unite its dominant faith. He summoned bishops from across the known world to the city of Nicaea in modern-day Turkey. Imagine the scene: over 300 bishops, many still bearing the physical scars of persecution from the recent Diocletian era, now gathered at the emperor's personal invitation. They arrived from Egypt, Syria, Greece, and beyond, a diverse group representing a faith that had never before had to officially define itself on such a scale. Constantine himself presided, not as a theologian, but as a statesman, a patron, and a peacemaker desperate for imperial unity. The central figure in the debate was a priest from Alexandria named Arius, a charismatic and persuasive speaker. He argued that if the Father begat the Son, then the Son must have had a beginning. Therefore, there was a time when the Son was not. To Arius and his followers, Christ was a sublime creation, a divine intermediary, but not co-eternal or co-equal with the Father. This idea, known as Arianism, was rapidly gaining popularity, resonating with those who found the concept of a triune God philosophically challenging. Opposing him was a young deacon, also from Alexandria, named Athanasius. With fierce determination, Athanasius argued that only a truly divine Son could accomplish humanity's salvation. If Christ were merely a creature, he insisted, then Christians were guilty of worshipping a creation idolatry, and their faith was in vain. The debates were intense and deeply philosophical, hinging on a single Greek word, homoousios, meaning of the same substance. Was the Son homoousios with the Father? This term became the lightning rod. Some bishops were wary of it because it wasn't directly drawn from Scripture, while others saw it as the only bulwark against what they perceived as a faith-destroying heresy. After weeks of passionate argument, the council overwhelmingly sided with Athanasius's view. The creed they produced was a definitive statement: Jesus Christ was God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. The Council of Nicaea's impact was immediate and earth-shaking. It gave the Church a universal statement of belief, the Nicene Creed, that would become the gold standard of orthodoxy for most Christian denominations to this day. But its consequences stretched far beyond theology. For the first time, a Roman emperor had directly intervened in a church dispute, setting a powerful precedent for the intertwining of imperial power and religious doctrine. This fusion of church and state would define the relationship between throne and altar for over 1,000 years in both East and West. The Council also established a model for using ecumenical gatherings to resolve doctrinal crises, creating a template for future centuries. While the Arian controversy would sputter on for decades, Nicaea had drawn a line in the sand. It demonstrated that in the medieval world to come, ideas were not just intellectual pursuits, they were the very foundations of power, identity, and empire. Just over a century after Nicaea, another theological firestorm erupted, but this time the debate centered not on the nature of Christ, but on the status of his mother. The year was 431, and the setting was the bustling city of Ephesus, a major center of early Christianity where tradition held that the Virgin Mary had spent her final years. The question before the council seemed, on its surface, to be about a single word, a title. Should Mary be honored as Theotokos, a Greek term meaning God-bearer? To modern ears, this might sound like a minor semantic argument, but in the 5th century, it was a debate that cut to the very core of how believers understood the incarnation of Jesus. The conflict was personified by two towering and fiercely opposed church leaders. On one side was Nestorius, the Archbishop of Constantinople. A renowned and eloquent preacher, Nestorius was deeply concerned with protecting the full humanity of Jesus. He worried that calling Mary the God-bearer could imply that God himself had a beginning or was born from a human, which to him blurred the critical line between the divine and the human natures in Christ. Instead, he proposed the title Christotokos, or Christ-bearer, a term he felt more accurately safeguarded the distinction between Jesus's divine and human aspects. His teachings alarmed many, who heard in them a dangerous separation, a suggestion that within Jesus were two distinct persons, one divine and one human, loosely united rather than perfectly fused. Leading the charge against him was Cyril, the powerful and uncompromising Patriarch of Alexandria. Cyril was a master theologian and a formidable political operator. He argued that Nestorius's distinction effectively split Christ in two and undermined the entire logic of salvation. If the divine Word of God did not personally unite himself to human nature in the womb of Mary, Cyril contended, then humanity was not truly saved. To deny Mary the title Theotokos was, in his view, to deny that God had truly come in the flesh. This was not just about honoring Mary, it was a definitive statement about her son. Calling her the God-bearer was the ultimate affirmation that the child she bore was, from the moment of conception, fully God and fully human. When Emperor Theodosius II called a council in Ephesus to settle the matter, the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation. The proceedings were anything but orderly. Cyril, arriving early with his supporters, convened the council before the pro-Nestorius bishops from Antioch had even arrived. With the backing of the local populace who were fiercely devoted to the Virgin Mary, Cyril's faction quickly moved to condemn and depose Nestorius. When the Antiochene bishops finally reached Ephesus, they were outraged at the fait accompli and held their own counter-council, which in turn condemned Cyril. The city was thrown into an uproar, with factions shouting in the streets and intense political pressure coming from the imperial court in Constantinople, which struggled to manage the escalating crisis. Ultimately, Cyril's political maneuvering and the fervent support of the people of Ephesus carried the day. The council affirmed the title Theotokos as orthodox doctrine and condemned Nestorius as a heretic. He was removed from his see and sent into exile, his teachings formally rejected. The immediate outcome was a profound strengthening of Marian devotion across the Christian world. Churches were dedicated to the Theotokos, her image began to feature more prominently in art, and hymns were composed in her honor, solidifying a central place for her in Christian liturgy and personal piety that continues to this day in Catholic and Orthodox traditions. Yet the Council's victory came at a tremendous cost. The deep divisions it exposed or created never fully healed. The Assyrian Church of the East and other Eastern churches rejected the outcome, leading to a permanent schism that fractured Christianity along cultural and theological lines. The fallout also intensified the long-standing rivalry between the great sees of Alexandria and Constantinople, a power struggle within the Church that had significant political repercussions for the Byzantine Empire. The Council of Ephesus stands as a powerful testament to how a debate over a single, nuanced title could unleash forces that reshaped the spiritual landscape, proving that in the medieval world, words were not merely words. They were the very architecture of belief, identity, and power. If the Council of Ephesus was a battle over a title, the Council of Chalcedon 2 decades later was the full-scale war over the nature of reality itself. The dust had barely settled from the Theotokos controversy when a new and equally complex theological dispute erupted, forcing another emperor to summon the bishops in a desperate attempt to find consensus. This time, the question was not about Mary, but about the very mechanics of the Incarnation. How exactly do the divine and human natures coexist within the single person of Jesus Christ? The answers they forged in 451 would become some of the most definitive and divisive in all of Christian history. The conflict was sparked by the teachings of an archimandrite named Eutyches in Constantinople. In his zealous desire to defend the unity of Christ's person after the Nestorian controversy, he argued that after the Incarnation, Christ's human nature was so absorbed by his divine nature that they essentially merged into a single divine nature. This view, known as Monophysitism from the Greek words for one and nature, alarmed many who felt it diminished Christ's true and full humanity. If Christ wasn't fully human, how could he truly represent humanity, understand human suffering, or redeem human nature? The debate became a theological firestorm, pulling in powerful bishops, imperial advisors, and even the Pope in Rome, Emperor Marcian, seeking to impose order on an empire threatening to tear itself apart over doctrinal fine points, called for a great council at Chalcedon, across the Bosphorus from Constantinople. It was an immense gathering, dwarfing even Nicaea, with over 500 bishops in attendance. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the political and theological rivalries that had been simmering for decades. The bishops were not just debating abstract ideas, they were navigating a minefield of imperial pressure, ecclesiastical ambition, and deep-seated cultural differences between the Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West. After weeks of intense and often acrimonious debate, the council produced a defining declaration. They rejected both the extreme separation of Nestorius and the extreme fusion of Eutyches. Instead, they articulated the doctrine of the hypostatic union, that Jesus Christ is one person or hypostasis in two natures, divine and human. These two natures, the council decreed, are united without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation. It was a breathtakingly precise and paradoxical formula, an attempt to hold two seemingly opposite truths in perfect balance. Christ is not half God and half man, nor a hybrid mixture. He is completely and fully God, and at the very same time completely and fully human, all within one person. The immediate aftermath, however, was not the unity the emperor had hoped for. For many bishops, particularly from Egypt, Syria, and Armenia, the language of two natures sounded dangerously close to the Nestorianism they had already condemned. They felt the definition compromised the beautiful, mystical unity of Christ they cherished. Their refusal to accept the Chalcedonian formula led to a permanent and painful schism. These churches, today known as the Oriental Orthodox Communion, including the Coptic, Armenian, and Syriac churches, broke away, forming their own enduring Christian tradition. The council, designed to unify, had instead created a lasting fault line in Christendom, a division that would define the religious map of the Middle East for the next 1500 years. Beyond the profound Christological definition, the Council of Chalcedon had another lasting impact that would shape the medieval world in a more political way. In its later sessions, the council issued a series of disciplinary canons. One of these, Canon 28, granted the See of Constantinople, the new Rome, honorary privileges and jurisdiction equal to those of the ancient See of Rome. This was a direct challenge to the growing claims of papal primacy and instantly sparked a furious reaction from Pope Leo the Great in Rome, who refused to ratify it. This clash set the stage for the escalating tension between the papacy and the Byzantine Patriarchate, a rivalry over spiritual authority and prestige that would eventually culminate in the Great Schism between East and West 6 centuries later. In its quest for doctrinal clarity, the Council of Chalcedon not only divided the Church theologically, but also fundamentally reshaped its geopolitical structure, creating fractures in the body of Christ that still remain visible today. While the great councils of the Eastern Roman Empire were wrestling with high Christology, on the far western edge of the old Roman world, a very different kind of meeting was about to take place, one where faith was wielded not to define divinity, but to forge a nation. In the year 589, in the city of Toledo, a young Visigothic king named Herford made a decision that would utterly transform the Iberian Peninsula. His father, King Leovigild, had been the most powerful Visigothic ruler yet, using military might and political savvy to unite much of the peninsula under his rule. But there was a crack in the foundation of his new kingdom, a deep and enduring divide. The Visigoths were Arians, a branch of Christianity declared heretical at Nicaea, while the vast majority of the population they ruled, the Hispano-Roman elite, were fervent adherents of Nicene Catholicism. This wasn't just a theological difference, it was a social and political chasm. The Arian Goths were the military ruling class, while the Catholic Romans were the educated, landowning, and administrative class. Two communities living side by side but divided by liturgy, law, and a mutual suspicion that had festered for generations. Herford understood that true unity could not be achieved by the sword alone. To create a single, stable kingdom, he needed to bridge this spiritual schism, and so he chose to cross over himself. In 587, he privately converted to Catholicism. But a king's private faith is a public matter. To make his conversion the kingdom's conversion, he needed a grand, public, and undeniable spectacle of unity. This was the purpose of the Third Council of Toledo. He summoned not only his Arian Gothic bishops and nobles, but also the Catholic bishops of the Hispanic provinces. The scene must have been tense, a gathering of two long antagonistic groups now convened to dismantle the very barrier that defined them. The council's opening was a dramatic piece of political theater. King Herford stood before the assembly and, with the eyes of the entire kingdom upon him, publicly and solemnly renounced Arianism. He declared his full faith in the Nicene Creed and the Catholic faith. He wasn't just speaking for himself, he was repudiating the core identity of the Visigothic people for over 2 centuries. This breathtaking act of royal will created a powerful momentum. One by one, the Arian bishops and Gothic nobles followed suit, signing documents of conversion and swearing allegiance to the new religious order. The council then formally proclaimed Catholicism the official religion of the Visigothic kingdom. The decrees that followed were sweeping, meticulously designed to erase the old divisions and weld the 2 populations into one. Arian churches and their properties were transferred to the Catholic Church. Laws were passed against any public practice of Arianism, but the council's vision went beyond mere suppression. It actively promoted assimilation. It lifted the ban on intermarriage between Goths and Romans, a huge social step designed to blend the ruling military caste with the cultured landowning class. The council's canons were then integrated directly into the Visigothic law code, the Forum Iudicum, creating a revolutionary fusion of Germanic customary law and Roman legal tradition. For the first time, the kingdom had a unified legal framework based on a shared religious identity. Yet, this project of unification had a dark and ominous side. In creating a new, cohesive Catholic identity for Goth and Roman alike, the council needed a common other, an external group to define itself against. That group was the Jewish population of Spain. The council issued a series of brutally oppressive decrees targeting Jews, forbidding mixed marriages, banning Jews from holding public office, and even ordering the forced baptism of the children of mixed Jewish-Christian marriages. This was a tragic and fateful turning point. While anti-Jewish sentiments existed before, the Third Council of Toledo institutionalized religious persecution as a tool of state policy, setting a terrible precedent that would echo through Spanish history for centuries, culminating in the eventual expulsion of Jews in 1492. The council's success in unifying the majority came at the devastating cost of marginalizing a minority, a stark lesson in how the forging of a national identity can often be built upon the exclusion of others. The template was set, and medieval kings across Europe would look to Record's council as a powerful model. Use a council to declare religious unity, and in doing so, consolidate your own power, integrate your elites, and define your kingdom against those who do not belong. Now imagine a king facing a dilemma not of armies or taxes, but of calendars. In the Kingdom of Northumbria, in the year 664, King Oswiu found his court and his kingdom divided over a question that seems almost trivial to modern ears: when should Easter be celebrated? This was far more than a scheduling conflict. It was a profound cultural and spiritual fault line running right through the heart of his realm. On one side was the enduring tradition of Celtic Christianity, brought to Britain by monks from Ireland and the north, which calculated the date of Easter using its own ancient methods. On the other side was the Roman practice, championed by missionaries sent from the continent by the Pope, which used a different calculation. The result was chaotic and deeply embarrassing for the king. There were years when Queen Eanfled, who followed the Roman rite, would still be solemnly observing the Lenten fast, while the king and his court, following the Celtic calendar, were already joyously celebrating the resurrection feast. The same palace would be split between fasting and feasting, a powerful symbol of a kingdom at odds with itself. This was the crisis that compelled Oswiu to call the Synod of Whitby, gathering the leading spiritual minds of his day to his cliff-top fortress at Whitby, presided over by the formidable Abbess Hilda. The debate was framed as a technical one, centered on 2 main issues: the proper method for calculating the date of Easter and the appropriate style of tonsure, the way monks shaved their heads. But everyone in that room knew the stakes were infinitely higher. This was a clash between 2 worlds, 2 visions of Christianity, and 2 spheres of influence. The Celtic Church, with its deeply ascetic, monastic focus and its isolated, island-based learning, prized its independence and its unique traditions inherited from the great saints of Ireland. The Roman party, led by the persuasive cleric Wilfrid, argued for uniformity with the universal practices of the Church centered in Rome, warning that to follow a separate path was to risk isolation and even error. Wilfrid's argument was masterful and politically astute. He didn't just argue from custom, he argued from authority. He invoked the figure of Saint Peter, the apostle to whom Christ had given the keys to the kingdom of heaven. The Roman method, Wilfrid declared, was the method of Peter, the keeper of the gates. Who were they, he implied, to defy the very guardian of heaven's gate? This appeal to the ultimate spiritual authority was a decisive blow. Faced with the choice between the traditions of his ancestors and the authority of the Apostle Peter, King Oswiu famously asked which side had the better connection to heaven's doorkeeper. When it was confirmed that it was indeed Peter, the king declared that he would not risk opposing him, lest when he came to the pearly gates himself, there would be no one to let him in. With that pragmatic and pious conclusion, he ruled in favor of the Roman practice. The immediate effect was administrative unity. The entire kingdom of Northumbria, and soon other Celtic-held areas in Britain, fell into line with the continental calendar. But the Synod of Whitby's true impact was seismic and far-reaching. This was not merely a change of date, it was a fundamental reorientation of English Christianity. By choosing Rome, Oswiu effectively pulled his kingdom out of the Celtic spiritual orbit and anchored it firmly within the Latin West. This opened the floodgates for Roman influence, from liturgical forms and architectural styles to ecclesiastical organization and intellectual exchange. It facilitated much closer political and cultural ties with the rising power of the Frankish kingdoms, and most importantly, with the papacy itself, weaving England into the emerging tapestry of medieval Europe. Conversely, the decision accelerated the gradual decline of the distinct and vibrant Celtic Christian tradition. Its unique artistic styles, its particular monastic structure, and its own scholarly traditions began to recede, absorbed into the dominant Roman model. The Synod stands as a perfect example of how a debate over what appears to be a minor point of practice, a calculation, a hairstyle, can actually be the vehicle for a monumental civilizational shift. It was a moment where a king, seeking unity in his hall, inadvertently chose the future cultural destiny of his nation, trading one identity for another and setting a course that would define England for 1,000 years to come. Just a few years after the Synod of Whitby set England on a Roman course, a different kind of meeting would take place to build the very framework of that new future. While Whitby had been about doctrine and calendar, the Council of Herford in 673 was about structure and organization, the unglamorous but utterly vital work of institution building. Imagine the challenge facing the English Church at this moment. It was a patchwork of independent monastic communities and missionary outposts, each with its own local customs and loyalties, lacking any coherent national structure. There was no clear chain of command, no standardized territories, and no universal set of rules. This administrative chaos threatened to undermine the very unity that Whitby had sought to achieve. Into this organizational void stepped one of the most remarkable figures of the early medieval church, Archbishop Theodore of Tarsus, a learned Greek monk from Asia Minor. Theodore was a surprising choice for the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was 66 years old when Pope Vitalian appointed him and sent him to England, a land whose language he did not speak and whose customs were entirely foreign to him. Yet he brought with him something the fledgling English church desperately needed: a profound knowledge of canon law, theology, and perhaps most importantly, the sophisticated administrative traditions of the wider Mediterranean Church. He arrived not as a conquering missionary, but as a master architect, ready to draw up the blueprints for a unified ecclesiastical kingdom. The Council of Herford, convened under Theodore's leadership, was his masterstroke. Its primary achievement was the systematic reorganization of the entire English Church into a clear network of territorial dioceses. Before this, bishoprics were often vague, overlapping, or based on tribal kingdoms rather than defined geographical areas. Theodore rationalized this system, establishing fixed boundaries for each diocese centered around a cathedral city. This meant every village, every farmstead, and every person now fell under the spiritual care of a specific bishop, ensuring that pastoral responsibility, like baptism, confirmation, and discipline, was no longer a matter of chance but of organized, universal coverage. It was the creation of an administrative grid for the soul of the nation, but the council did not stop at drawing lines on a map. It issued a comprehensive set of canons, ecclesiastical laws, that touched nearly every aspect of religious and social life. These rules imposed strict discipline on the clergy, forbidding them from wandering from their dioceses without permission and cracking down on lax behavior. They standardized regulations for Christian marriage, defining forbidden degrees of kinship and working to bring Anglo-Saxon customary law into alignment with wider Christian practice. The council also issued directives for monastic life, promoting the Benedictine rule that would later become the gold standard across Europe. This was about creating a single, recognizable English church, where the practices in Northumbria would be fundamentally the same as those in Kent or Wessex. The genius of Theodore's approach was how he blended firm central authority with pragmatic local sensitivity, while he powerfully strengthened the office of the Archbishop of Canterbury, making it the undisputed center of English ecclesiastical gravity. He was also shrewdly inclusive. He appointed able men from different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms as his bishops, fostering a new pan-English identity among the clergy that transcended old tribal rivalries. The Council of Herford didn't just create a church administration. It actively helped forge a sense of being English, a shared spiritual citizenship that would eventually pave the way for political unity under later kings. By providing a stable, uniform structure, Theodore gave the English Church a resilience that allowed it to survive the devastating Viking invasions of the next century and emerge as a cornerstone of medieval European culture. This meeting proves that sometimes the most enduring revolutions are not fought over grand ideas, but are built patiently, clause by clause, in the quiet work of organization and law. Just as the Council of Chalcedon had sought to find a perfect balance between Christ's divine and human natures, a new and equally subtle controversy emerged a few centuries later, this time focusing not on what Christ was, but on what he willed. The year was 680, and the Byzantine Empire was once again embroiled in a theological firestorm, but this one carried an even heavier dose of imperial politics. The doctrine in question was called Monothelitism, from the Greek words for one and will. Its proponents, including several Byzantine emperors, argued that while Jesus Christ had two natures, as Chalcedon had declared, he possessed only one divine will. This wasn't just an abstract philosophical refinement. It was a politically motivated compromise designed to win back the loyalty of the Monophysite populations in Egypt and Syria, who had been alienated by Chalcedon's two natures formula. By emphasizing a single divine will, the imperial court hoped to create a theological bridge that could reunite the fractured empire. For decades, this imperial-backed doctrine held sway, enforced as official policy. But a powerful opposition began to coalesce, led by a courageous monk from Jerusalem named Sophronius, and later championed by a towering intellectual figure, Saint Maximus the Confessor. They argued with immense passion and precision that a single divine will would render Christ's humanity incomplete and unreal. If Christ did not possess a truly human will, they reasoned, then his human experiences, his hunger, his fatigue, his anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane when he prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done," were nothing more than a divine puppet show, a performance without any authentic human struggle or choice. This, to them, shattered the very logic of salvation. For humanity to be redeemed, Christ had to have redeemed the human will itself by freely submitting his human will in perfect obedience to the divine will. Without a human will to surrender, his obedience was meaningless and humanity was not truly saved. The debate reached a critical juncture with the ascension of a new emperor, Constantine IV. Perhaps weary of the constant theological strife or recognizing the doctrine's failure to actually pacify the provinces, he took the extraordinary step of writing to Pope Agatho in Rome, effectively inviting the West to adjudicate the dispute. This was a monumental moment, a tacit acknowledgement of the growing moral authority of the papacy in matters of doctrine. Pope Agatho convened a synod in Rome that firmly affirmed the two wills position and sent a detailed letter and legates to Constantinople. Emperor Constantine then convened the Third Council of Constantinople, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, which met for a series of sessions over the course of a year. The council's proceedings were a masterclass in theological and political negotiation. The emperor himself attended many sessions, not as a theologian but as a presiding authority, deeply invested in an outcome that would finally bring peace. The Council Fathers meticulously examined Scripture and the writings of the early Church Fathers, and the case for two wills proved overwhelming. They declared that Christ possessed two natural wills and two natural operations, divine and human, not in opposition, as the decree carefully stated, but as his human will follows, not resisting or reluctant, but rather subject to his divine and all-powerful will. This was the crucial nuance. The human will was not abolished or absorbed. It was perfected through its free and loving submission to the divine. The Council's decision was a stunning rebuke to a half-century of imperial religious policy. It was a powerful assertion that the Church, through its bishops and councils, held the final authority in defining doctrine, even when that doctrine was directly opposed by the emperor and his court. This marked a significant moment in the long, slow separation of ecclesiastical and imperial power in the East. Furthermore, the Council's close collaboration with the Pope of Rome highlighted the still-functioning unity between East and West, but it also sowed seeds of future discord. The Council's canons explicitly condemned previous patriarchs of Constantinople as heretics, a humiliation that the See of Constantinople would not soon forget, fostering a deep-seated resentment against what was perceived as Roman interference. The struggle over Monothelitism and the council that ended it was far more than a chapter in a theological textbook. It was a dramatic episode in the ancient struggle between truth and power, a definitive statement that some lines could not be crossed, even for the sake of political unity. It proved that the most profound questions of human identity and divine purpose could not be settled by imperial decree alone, but required the collective discernment of a faith community seeking to understand the mysterious nature of its Savior. While the Council of Constantinople had been a dramatic assertion of church authority over an emperor, a new kind of power was rising in the West, one that would itself seek to master the council as an instrument of its own will. Enter Charlemagne, a king whose ambition was not merely to rule lands, but to forge an entire civilization. By the year 794, his Frankish empire stretched across much of Western Europe, a vast and patchwork realm of diverse peoples, languages, and local customs. Charlemagne's grand project, what historians would later call the Carolingian Renaissance, was a conscious effort to resurrect the glory of the Roman Empire, but under a distinctly Christian and Frankish banner. His challenge was immense: how to bind together Saxons, Lombards, Aquitanians, and Franks into a single, cohesive body. His brilliant solution was to use the unifying power of the Christian faith, and to that end, he summoned a massive council to his royal palace at Frankfurt, a gathering that would perfectly illustrate his vision of a kingdom where the spiritual and the secular were two sides of the same imperial coin. The official theological reason for the council was to confront a heresy brewing in the distant Christian communities of Spain. A bishop named Felix of Urgel was promoting a doctrine known as adoptionism, which argued that Jesus Christ, in his humanity, was not the eternal Son of God by nature, but was rather adopted as the Son at his baptism. To the learned theologians in Charlemagne's court, this was a dangerous error that threatened the core of the Christian understanding of salvation. If Christ was not truly God and truly man from the moment of conception, then his saving work was invalid. The council, attended by over 300 bishops from across the Frankish Empire and with legates from the Pope, swiftly and unanimously condemned adoptionism. This was more than a theological victory. It was a powerful statement of doctrinal unity under Frankish leadership, positioning Charlemagne not just as a political ruler, but as the defender of orthodoxy for the entire West. But Charlemagne's vision for the Council of Frankfurt extended far beyond condemning a Spanish bishop. His true genius lay in using this spiritual assembly to address the gritty, practical necessities of running a vast empire. In a move that startles modern observers used to separating church and state, the council's agenda seamlessly pivoted from high theology to hard economics. It issued decisive decrees on coinage reform, outlawing the old, debased coinage and mandating a new, standardized silver penny to be used across the entire realm. This was a revolutionary act of economic centralization. For the first time, a merchant in Mainz could use the same currency as a trader in Toulouse, dramatically simplifying commerce, stabilizing prices, and strengthening the crown's control over the economy. The council also tackled pressing social issues, passing legislation on grain prices during a famine to prevent profiteering and reaffirming laws against usury. This blending of the sacred and the secular was the hallmark of Charlemagne's rule and the central achievement of Frankfurt. He understood that a unified empire required more than just shared beliefs. It needed shared practices. To that end, the council took major steps toward enforcing liturgical uniformity. It promoted the use of the Gregorian sacramentary, a standardized book of prayers and rituals for Mass, and encouraged the adoption of the Roman chant, later known as Gregorian chant, throughout the empire's churches. This meant that whether you were worshipping in a cathedral in Otchen or a small parish church in the Italian Alps, the liturgy would be fundamentally the same. This created a powerful, rhythmic unity to daily life, a shared experience of faith that transcended local dialects and customs, acoustically weaving the empire together. The Council of Frankfurt stands as a monumental example of the Carolingian Renaissance in action. It was a key moment in a sprawling cultural project that involved the mass copying of ancient manuscripts in a new, clear script Carolingian minuscule, the reform of education to ensure a literate clergy and bureaucracy, and the promotion of art and architecture inspired by Roman models. Through councils like this one, Charlemagne didn't just command obedience, he cultivated a shared cultural identity. He used the authority of the church to sanctify his political program, and he used his political power to enforce religious orthodoxy and uniformity. The council wasn't just a meeting, it was a masterclass in statecraft, demonstrating how a visionary ruler could leverage a gathering of bishops to reform everything from the words of a prayer to the weight of a coin, all in the relentless pursuit of a unified Christian empire. If the Council of Frankfurt under Charlemagne was about building a unified empire through coinage and liturgy, the Council of Otchen under his son, Louis the Pious, was about perfecting the soul of that empire from within. Louis inherited a realm that was politically vast but spiritually inconsistent. Monastic life, the very bedrock of medieval society, was a patchwork of traditions. Some monasteries followed the rule of Saint Benedict, others the Celtic rule of Saint Columbanus, and many operated under their own local customs with varying degrees of discipline. This lack of uniformity troubled the deeply devout Louis. He saw in this spiritual anarchy a threat to the entire Carolingian project, for it was the monasteries that prayed for the empire's salvation, preserved its learning, and provided a model of heavenly order for earthly society. His solution was not conquest but codification. He would call a council not to debate enemies or economics, but to standardize sanctity itself. In 817, Louis summoned abbots and bishops from across the realm to his capital at Otchen. This was not a sprawling gathering of hundreds, it was a more focused, deliberate assembly of the most influential monastic leaders. Their task was monumental yet precise: to examine, approve, and mandate a single, universal standard for monastic life. The text they chose was the Rule of Saint Benedict, a 6th century guide for communal living written by the father of Western monasticism. But this was not a simple rubber stamp approval. Louis and his chief advisor, the renowned monk Benedict of Anian, had prepared a meticulously revised and expanded version of the rule. Benedict of Anian was a living encyclopedia of monastic knowledge, having studied every major rule in existence. His version of the Benedictine rule was designed to be the definitive article, clarifying ambiguities, strengthening provisions for discipline, and ensuring it could be applied uniformly from the rainy monasteries of Ireland to the sun-baked cloisters of Italy. The Council's primary output was a sweeping piece of legislation known as the Institutio Canonicorum, or the Ordinance for Canons. This document did far more than just tell monks when to pray. It sought to reshape their entire existence into a single, harmonious rhythm. It prescribed the exact number of psalms to be sung at each of the 8 daily prayer offices. It detailed the amount and type of food and drink to be consumed. It laid out the specific duties of every office within the monastery, from the abbot down to the newest novice, creating a clear and efficient hierarchy. It even standardized the monastic habit. The goal was to eliminate local variety and personal interpretation. In every Benedictine house across the empire, the daily routine, the liturgy, the diet, and the structure of authority would now be identical. This was the spiritual equivalent of Charlemagne's coinage reform, a single standard to guarantee quality and authenticity across the entire realm. The impact of this standardization rippled out far beyond the monastery walls, catalyzing a cultural and intellectual revolution. With their daily lives now regimented by a universal rule, monasteries were freed from internal disputes over practice and could focus their immense energy outward. The rule's emphasis on ora et labora, prayer and work, sanctified intellectual labor as a form of divine service. This led to an explosion of activity in the scriptorium, the monastery's writing room. Scribes, following the new culture of discipline and excellence, began a massive project to copy and preserve ancient texts, not only the Bible and liturgical books, but also the works of Roman poets, Greek philosophers, and early church fathers. This painstaking work saved a vast treasure of classical learning from being lost forever during the turbulent centuries ahead. Furthermore, the Council's reforms supercharged education. Monasteries were required to establish schools to educate both young monks destined for the cloister and the sons of nobles, creating a newly literate class that would eventually staff the imperial bureaucracy. They became islands of stability and learning, offering essential social services like caring for the sick and providing shelter for travelers, thus acting as a vital welfare system for the broader community. The Council of Otchen, by seeking to impose a single spiritual standard, inadvertently became one of history's most powerful engines for cultural preservation. It transformed monasteries from isolated, independent communities into a networked, empire-wide system of powerhouses for prayer, learning, and charity, ensuring that the flame of knowledge would continue to burn brightly through the coming dark ages. Now shift the scene entirely. We leave behind the world of imperial synods and monastic reforms and travel to the year 1129 to the bustling French town of Troyes. Here, a very different kind of meeting was about to take place, one that would not define a doctrine or reform a liturgy, but would instead breathe life into one of history's most legendary and enigmatic organizations, the Knights Templar. A decade earlier, in the volatile aftermath of the First Crusade, a small band of 9 French knights, led by a nobleman named Hugh de Payens, had made a startling vow. They would dedicate their lives not to acquiring land or wealth, but to a sacred and dangerous mission, protecting the stream of Christian pilgrims flooding into the newly captured city of Jerusalem. The roads from the coast to the Holy City were a lethal gauntlet plagued by bandits and raiders. These knights proposed a radical new idea: to become warrior monks, men who would take the traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but who would also wield the sword in active defense of the faithful. For years, they were a curious and impoverished novelty, operating out of a wing of Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque, which they believed was the site of King Solomon's temple, hence their name, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. They were caught in a frustrating limbo, too few to be effective, too unconventional to be fully accepted by either the church or the nobility. They were monks who killed, soldiers who prayed, a paradox that made the established powers deeply uneasy. What they desperately needed was official papal sanction. They needed the stamp of approval from the highest authority in Christendom to transform their humble brotherhood into a legitimate international force. Hugh de Payens spent years traveling through Europe, drumming up support and lobbying for formal recognition. His efforts culminated in the Council of Troyes, a gathering presided over by a papal legate and attended by some of the most powerful churchmen and nobles of France, including the immensely influential abbot Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was the real star of this council, a renowned mystic, a powerful preacher, and a key reformer of the Cistercian monastic order. His opinion carried immense weight. He saw in the Templars not a troubling paradox, but a divine inspiration, the perfect fusion of the monastic and knightly ideals. He became their most fervent and effective champion. At the council, he passionately argued their case, portraying them as a new kind of knighthood, a militia of Christ that channeled the violent impulses of the warrior class into a holy cause. His advocacy was the turning point. The council fathers, swayed by his eloquence and authority, did far more than just give the group a nod of approval. They meticulously examined and officially endorsed the primitive rule of the Templars, a Latin rule of conduct that outlined their way of life in 72 articles. This rule, likely drafted with Bernard's direct input, governed everything from their prayers and diet to their conduct in battle and their distinctive white mantles, which the council officially granted them the right to wear. This papal endorsement was the rocket fuel that propelled the Templars onto the world stage. Overnight, they were transformed from an obscure band of well-meaning soldiers into a papally sanctioned, international religious order. The Council's blessing was a signal to every nobleman in Europe that supporting the Templars was not just a charitable act, but a pious duty that could benefit one's soul. Donations of land, money, and noble sons came flooding in. Their ranks swelled with new recruits from the best families. They were granted vast estates across Europe, which they managed with incredible efficiency to fund their operations in the East. This economic network soon evolved into a sophisticated banking system where pilgrims could deposit funds in Europe and withdraw them in the Holy Land, a service that made them incredibly wealthy and powerful. The Council of Troyes had unwittingly midwifed the creation of the world's first multinational corporation, an organization that was simultaneously an army, a charity, and a bank. Their legitimization set a powerful precedent, inspiring the creation of other military orders like the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights, and fundamentally shaping the strategy, finance, and very nature of the Crusades for the next 2 centuries. A single meeting in a French town, convened to approve a set of rules for a few dozen men, had unleashed a force that would reshape the medieval world. Yet, even as the Templars were being forged into a unified instrument of papal will, the very source of that authority, the papacy itself, was tearing apart at the seams. Just a few years after the Council of Troyes, the Church found itself in an almost unthinkable crisis. It had 2 popes. The year was 1135, and what began as a dispute over an election had spiraled into a full-blown schism that threatened to shatter the unity of Western Christendom. On one side was Pope Innocent II, widely recognized by most of Europe's kings and bishops. On the other was Anacletus II, a forceful and well-connected figure who held sway over Rome itself and enjoyed significant support. For years, these 2 men excommunicated each other's supporters, appointed rival bishops to the same sees, and created a paralyzing duality at the very heart of the Church. The faithful were left in a state of confusion and anxiety. Who was the true vicar of Christ, whose sacraments were valid? This was more than a political squabble. It was a spiritual emergency that undermined the very foundation of medieval society. Into this chaos stepped a bold group of leading churchmen, powerful archbishops, cardinals, and abbots who decided that if the papal office itself was the source of the problem, then a higher authority must be summoned to solve it. They called for a general council to be held in the great maritime republic of Pisa. This was a radical and almost unprecedented move. The traditional understanding was that a council could only be called and presided over by a pope. But here was a council called by the Church's princes to sit in judgment upon the popes. Their argument was one of necessity. In a time of such dire crisis, the Universal Church, represented by its bishops in council, held a supreme authority that could even override the claims of a pontiff. This idea, which would later blossom into a full-blown theory known as conciliarism, was about to be tested for the very first time. The Council of Pisa was a formidable gathering, a who's who of the European ecclesiastical elite. It drew hundreds of bishops, abbots, and theologians from France, Germany, England, and Italy. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of historic purpose and profound gravity. They were not there to debate subtle points of theology, but to perform emergency surgery on the body of Christ itself. After carefully examining the claims of both Innocent and Anacletus, the council reached a stunning verdict. They declared that both men had been elected through flawed processes tainted by simony and political manipulation. Therefore, both were illegitimate. In one sweeping act, the Council Fathers deposed both popes and declared the See of Rome vacant. They then ordered the College of Cardinals present at the council to hold a new, proper election. The man they chose was a respected elder cardinal who took the name Pope Gregory VIII. It was a breathtaking exercise of collective authority, a bold attempt to cure the disease by removing the infected organs. In theory, it was a masterstroke. In practice, it was a catastrophic miscalculation. The council had made a critical error. It assumed that its reasoned judgment would be obeyed simply because it was right. But neither Innocent nor Anacletus accepted the council's authority to depose them. Instead of solving the two-way schism, the Council of Pisa had inadvertently created a three-way schism. Now there were three men all claiming to be the rightful pope, each with their own set of cardinals and their own armies of supporters. The situation went from bad to worse, descending into a deeper and more intractable chaos. Yet for all its immediate failure, the Council of Pisa left an indelible mark on history. It was the first time a large assembly of bishops had dared to assert that the authority of the entire church, gathered in council, could supersede that of an individual pope during a time of crisis. This was a revolutionary seed of an idea. It established a powerful precedent that would be revisited again and again over the next few centuries whenever the papacy fell into disrepute or disorder. The arguments honed at Pisa would be deployed with even greater force during the Great Schism of the 14th century and would fuel debates at the councils of Constance and Basel. It sparked an enduring conversation about the nature of authority within the Church. Was it vested solely in one man in Rome, or did it ultimately reside with the entire community of the faithful, represented by its leaders? This meeting, for all its messy and unsuccessful outcome, revealed a profound truth: that deep crisis can be a catalyst for intellectual innovation, forcing institutions to re-examine their most fundamental assumptions about power and where it truly lies. Pope Eugene III arrived at the Council of Rheims in 1148, not as a triumphant ruler, but as a fugitive. Just months earlier, he had been driven from Rome by a rebellious commune that rejected papal authority, forcing him to seek refuge in his native France. This context of political vulnerability hung heavily over the proceedings, coloring every debate and decision. Here was the Vicar of Christ presiding over a council of the Church's most powerful figures, yet unable to even set foot in his own city. This tension between immense spiritual authority and stark earthly weakness would define the council's dual nature. It was a gathering that had to project strength and certainty on matters of doctrine, while simultaneously navigating the treacherous waters of medieval power politics. The primary intellectual firefight of the council was aimed at a brilliant but controversial theologian, Gilbert de la Porree, the Bishop of Poitiers. A revered teacher and a razor-sharp logician in the burgeoning scholastic tradition, Gilbert had ventured into perilous territory with his complex teachings on the nature of God and the Trinity. He made a meticulous philosophical distinction between God as God, the divine essence, and the individual persons of the Trinity. To his critics, this sounded dangerously like he was dividing the indivisible, suggesting that God's essence was something separate from Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In an age where a misplaced preposition could be deemed heresy, such nuanced distinctions were seen not as academic exercises, but as dire threats to the salvation of every believer. The council, led by powerful figures like the ardent Cistercian Bernard of Clairvaux, put Gilbert's teachings on trial. The debates were intense, a clash between the new world of dialectical reasoning and the old guard of mystical faith. Under immense pressure, Gilbert ultimately agreed to retract the disputed propositions, though he maintained he had never intended to teach error. His condemnation sent a clear and chilling message to the schools of Paris and beyond. even the most sophisticated philosophical explorations had firm boundaries, and the Church would be the ultimate arbiter of where those boundaries lay. But the Council's gaze extended far beyond the lecture halls of academia to a much more visceral and spreading threat in the south of France, the heresy of Catharism. Unlike Gilbert's intellectual errors, Catharism was not a mere deviation. It was a rival religion. The Cathars, or Albigensians, preached a radical dualism, believing the material world was entirely the creation of an evil god, while the spiritual realm was the domain of a good God. They rejected the Catholic Church as the corrupt tool of the evil principle, denying the value of the sacraments, the authority of the priesthood, and even the goodness of creation itself. To Pope Eugene and the assembled bishops, this was an existential danger that was winning over entire communities with its message of purity and asceticism. The Council of Rheims responded not with philosophical debate, but with forceful disciplinary canons. It authorized bishops to hunt down these heretics in their dioceses, to exhume and burn the bodies of those who died in the heresy, and to destroy the homes that sheltered them. This was a significant and ominous escalation, moving from persuasion to persecution and laying the foundational legal groundwork for what would later become the Inquisition. The blending of the theological and the political was perfectly embodied in the Council's dramatic confrontation with a powerful prince of the Church, Hugh de Puiset, the Archbishop of Rouen. Hugh was everything a medieval prelate wasn't supposed to be: arrogant, worldly, and defiantly insubordinate. He had openly mocked papal authority, ignored directives from Rome, and lived a life of such blatant luxury and neglect that he had become a scandal in his own province. For Pope Eugene, this was a critical test of his weakened authority. To allow such open rebellion to stand would invite chaos. In a stunning move, the Council formally deposed Archbishop Hugh, stripping him of his office and excommunicating him. This act was a powerful reassertion of papal power over the often independent and powerful regional archbishops. It demonstrated that the Council was not just a doctrinal watchdog, but also a supreme court for ecclesiastical discipline, willing to topple one of its own most powerful members to enforce obedience. The Council of Rheims, therefore, stands as a pivotal moment of consolidation and hardening. It showed a church increasingly confident in its role as the definitive judge of ideas, willing to police the finest points of academic theology. Simultaneously, it revealed a growing anxiety about mass popular heresy, responding with a new legal harshness that prescribed seizure, exile, and fire. And through it all, it showcased a papacy determined to tighten its grip on the entire ecclesiastical structure, using councils like this one to enforce unity from the top down, even when its own temporal power was under siege. This meeting was a clear signal that the era of gentle correction was over, and a new, more combative phase of defending orthodoxy was beginning. Meanwhile, Pope Alexander III found himself presiding over the Third Lateran Council in 1179 from a position of hard-won authority. He had only recently emerged victorious from a grueling 18-year schism, with a series of anti-popes supported by the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. This experience of a church divided, of rival claimants and political meddling, profoundly shaped the Council's ambitious agenda. Alexander was determined to ensure such a catastrophic split could never happen again, and to rally a unified Christendom against both external enemies and internal decay. The result was one of the most comprehensive and forward-thinking councils of the entire Middle Ages, a gathering that sought to reform the Church from its very head down to its most remote parishes. The Council's very first action was its most consequential for the future governance of the Church. Haunted by the recent schism, the Fathers decreed that henceforth, the election of a pope would require a 2/3 majority vote from the College of Cardinals. This was a brilliant piece of political engineering designed to prevent the kind of factional deadlock that could lead to multiple claimants. By forcing a supermajority, the council ensured that any future pope would need to be a consensus candidate, acceptable to a broad swath of the cardinalate. This simple rule fundamentally altered the dynamics of papal elections, promoting stability and making future schisms far less likely. It remains the cornerstone of papal electoral law to this day, a direct legacy of the chaos Alexander III had endured. But the council's vision extended far beyond internal church politics, with the holy city of Jerusalem having fallen to the Muslim leader Saladin just a decade earlier. The cause of the crusade was a burning urgency. The Third Lateran Council officially launched what would become the Third Crusade, the famous campaign that would feature Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus. It called upon all Christian kings and princes to take up the cross, and to finance this monumental effort, it instituted a new tax known as the Saladin tithe, a 10% levy on all movables and revenues. This was one of the first truly universal taxes in medieval history, an unprecedented financial mobilization that demonstrated the papacy's growing ability to coordinate the economic resources of all of Europe for a single goal. The council also turned its reforming zeal inward, issuing a slew of canons aimed at cleaning up the clergy and protecting the faithful from corruption. It forbade the sale of church offices, the sin of simony, and condemned usury, particularly as practiced by moneylenders. It even showed a surprising degree of pastoral concern for the laity, decreeing that no fee should be charged for the administration of the sacraments like marriage or burial, ensuring the church's spiritual services remained accessible to the poor. In a move that highlighted the church's role as a social institution, it ordered every cathedral to set aside a portion of its revenue to provide relief for the needy, formalizing the concept of charitable obligation. Perhaps most significantly, the council took a firm and harsh stance against the rising tide of popular heresy, particularly the Waldensians and the Albigensians. The Waldensians, followers of a pious merchant from Lyon named Valdes, had begun preaching without papal permission and translating the Bible into the vernacular. The Albigensians, or Cathars, presented a far graver threat with their complete rejection of church doctrine. The council not only condemned both groups, but also took the drastic step of authorizing the use of force against them. It called upon Catholic princes to physically suppress these heretics and, in a fateful decision, declared that their property could be confiscated and their rights voided. This effectively made heresy not just a spiritual crime, but a civil one, inviting secular rulers to join the fight with the lure of material gain. This alliance between the spiritual and the temporal sword would soon erupt into the bloody Albigensian crusade, turning the south of France into a battlefield. The Third Lateran Council was a meeting of both healing and hardening, a gathering that sought to secure the Church's future by reforming its elections, rallying Christendom to a common cause, and drawing a rigid, unforgiving line around orthodoxy. Meanwhile, Pope Alexander III found himself presiding over the Third Lateran Council in 1179 from a position of hard-won authority. He had only recently emerged victorious from a grueling 18-year schism with a series of anti-popes supported by the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. This experience of a church divided, of rival claimants and political meddling, profoundly shaped the council's ambitious agenda. Alexander was determined to ensure such a catastrophic split could never happen again, and to rally a unified Christendom against both external enemies and internal decay. The result was one of the most comprehensive and forward-thinking councils of the entire Middle Ages, a gathering that sought to reform the Church from its very head down to its most remote parishes. The Council's very first action was its most consequential for the future governance of the Church. Haunted by the recent schism, the Fathers decreed that henceforth, the election of a pope would require a 2/3 majority vote from the College of Cardinals. This was a brilliant piece of political engineering designed to prevent the kind of factional deadlock that could lead to multiple claimants. By forcing a supermajority, the Council ensured that any future pope would need to be a consensus candidate, acceptable to a broad swath of the cardinalate. This simple rule fundamentally altered the dynamics of papal elections, promoting stability and making future schisms far less likely. It remains the cornerstone of papal electoral law to this day, a direct legacy of the chaos Alexander III had endured. But the Council's vision extended far beyond internal church politics, with the holy city of Jerusalem having fallen to the Muslim leader Saladin just a decade earlier. The cause of the crusade was a burning urgency. The Third Lateran Council officially launched what would become the Third Crusade, the famous campaign that would feature Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus. It called upon all Christian kings and princes to take up the cross, and to finance this monumental effort, it instituted a new tax known as the Saladin tithe, a 10% levy on all movables and revenues. This was one of the first truly universal taxes in medieval history, an unprecedented financial mobilization that demonstrated the papacy's growing ability to coordinate the economic resources of all of Europe for a single goal. The Council also turned its reforming zeal inward, issuing a slew of canons aimed at cleaning up the clergy and protecting the faithful from corruption. It forbade the sale of church offices, the sin of simony, and condemned usury, particularly as practiced by moneylenders. It even showed a surprising degree of pastoral concern for the laity, decreeing that no fee should be charged for the administration of the sacraments like marriage or burial, ensuring the Church's spiritual services remained accessible to the poor. In a move that highlighted the Church's role as a social institution, it ordered every cathedral to set aside a portion of its revenue to provide relief for the needy, formalizing the concept of charitable obligation. Perhaps most significantly, the Council took a firm and harsh stance against the rising tide of popular heresy, particularly the Waldensians and the Albigensians. The Waldensians, followers of a pious merchant from Lyon named Valdes, had begun preaching without papal permission and translating the Bible into the vernacular. The Albigensians, or Cathars, presented a far graver threat with their complete rejection of church doctrine. The Council not only condemned both groups, but also took the drastic step of authorizing the use of force against them. It called upon Catholic princes to physically suppress these heretics and, in a fateful decision, declared that their property could be confiscated and their rights voided. This effectively made heresy not just a spiritual crime, but a civil one, inviting secular rulers to join the fight with the lure of material gain. This alliance between the spiritual and the temporal sword would soon erupt into the bloody Albigensian crusade, turning the south of France into a battlefield. The Third Lateran Council was a meeting of both healing and hardening, a gathering that sought to secure the Church's future by reforming its elections, rallying Christendom to a common cause, and drawing a rigid, unforgiving line around orthodoxy. If the Third Lateran Council was a powerful reform effort, the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 was nothing less than a revolution codified. Convened by the formidable Pope Innocent III, it stands as the absolute zenith of papal power in the High Middle Ages, a monumental gathering whose 70 decrees reached into the soul of every believer and the structure of every community. Innocent, at the height of his authority, envisioned a church that was not just spiritually supreme, but also the central organizing principle of all Christendom. This council was his blueprint, a sweeping legislative act that sought to standardize belief, enforce discipline, define boundaries, and mobilize the entire continent for holy war. Its canons were so comprehensive, so detailed, and so profoundly impactful that they would shape the daily experience of being a Christian for centuries to come, creating a religious and social landscape whose outlines are still faintly visible today. The Council's theological definitions were its most enduring legacy, settling debates that had simmered for generations. Its most famous decree gave official, precise language to a mystery that had long been at the heart of the Eucharist. It defined the doctrine of transubstantiation, declaring that during the Mass, the bread and wine are not merely symbolic, but are truly transformed in their very substance into the body and blood of Christ, with only the appearances, the accidents of taste, sight, and touch remaining. This was a philosophical masterstroke that provided a clear, authoritative answer to a fundamental question of faith, centralizing the Mass as the literal encounter with the divine and elevating the priesthood as the only group with the power to perform this miracle. To ensure the faithful were spiritually prepared for this awesome encounter, another canon made annual confession and communion at Easter mandatory for every Christian. This created the Easter duty, a yearly rhythm of spiritual cleansing that brought the entire population into the confessional and then to the altar rail, weaving the Church's sacramental system into the very fabric of individual life and the calendar year. Beyond the sanctuary, the Council's decrees reached into the muddy streets of medieval towns and the quiet of Jewish quarters. In a move that profoundly altered the pastoral care of souls, it mandated that every diocese establish a school to train clergy, ensuring a better educated priesthood capable of preaching and teaching the increasingly complex doctrines of the faith. Yet this impulse for order and clarity had a dark and exclusionary side. In a fateful and tragic decision, Canon 68 required Jews and Muslims living in Christian lands to wear distinctive clothing, often a badge or a pointed hat, to prevent the unthinkable horror of accidental sexual relations between Christians and non-Christians. This act of state-sanctioned othering institutionalized humiliation and segregation, making religious minorities permanently visible and vulnerable targets for popular anger and official discrimination, setting a terrible precedent that would be exploited for generations. The Council's political and military ambitions were equally vast. It gave its full-throated endorsement to what would become the Fifth Crusade, calling for a new expedition to reclaim Jerusalem and offering plenary indulgences, the full remission of sins, to all who took up the cross. This spiritual incentive, combined with detailed plans for a coordinated military effort, demonstrated the papacy's role as the supreme commander of Christendom's collective might. Furthermore, it took a radical step against heresy, formally defining the procedure of inquisition and ordering secular rulers to exterminate heretics from their lands or face excommunication and the loss of their titles. This command effectively criminalized religious dissent, giving princes a holy mandate to persecute and providing the legal foundation for the Albigensian crusade already raging in southern France. The Fourth Lateran Council was the medieval papacy's most audacious attempt to construct a perfectly ordered Christian society, a world where doctrine was precise, sacraments were universal, boundaries were clear, and the authority of Rome was the ultimate guarantor of both earthly order and eternal salvation. Its influence was so deep and so wide that it is almost impossible to understand the next 300 years of European history without it. Pope Innocent IV arrived at the Council of Lyon in 1245, not as a spiritual shepherd seeking unity, but as a political general preparing for total war. He was a man in exile, driven from Rome by the very emperor he had come to condemn, and the air in Lyon crackled with the tension of their epic, decades-long confrontation. This was not to be a gathering for theological reflection or pastoral reform. It was a judicial inquest, a public tribunal with the most powerful ruler in the Western world sitting in the dock, albeit in absentia. The charge was nothing less than the complete demolition of a monarch's legitimacy, and the verdict would send shockwaves through the very foundations of medieval power, redefining for generations the volatile relationship between the crown and the cross. The defendant, Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, was a figure so brilliant, so unorthodox, and so formidable that his contemporaries called him Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world. King of Sicily, King of Jerusalem, and Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick was a Renaissance man born centuries too early. He was a multilingual scholar who patronized science and philosophy, an author who wrote a groundbreaking book on falconry, and a ruler who governed a cosmopolitan court in Palermo where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars worked side by side. But to the papacy, these very qualities made him not a wonder but a monster. His tolerance of Islam, his intellectual curiosity that often strayed into skepticism, and his ruthless, absolutist style of rule were seen not as modernizing efforts, but as evidence of profound heresy and tyranny. He had repeatedly broken his vows to go on crusade, and when he finally did go, he achieved the miraculous. He negotiated the peaceful surrender of Jerusalem without a fight, but did so while excommunicated, wearing the crown in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as a man officially cut off from God's grace. To Pope Innocent, Frederick was the ultimate nightmare, an emperor who refused to be subordinate, a Christian who defied papal authority, and a rationalist whose mind seemed to hold the Church itself in contempt. Innocent IV, a canon lawyer of unparalleled skill and determination, understood that to defeat such a foe, he needed more than just spiritual weapons. He needed the overwhelming force of international public opinion. The Council of Lyon was his stage. He meticulously packed it with his supporters, over 150 bishops, mostly from France, Spain, and England, regions where Frederick held little sway. The emperor's supporters from Germany and Italy were conspicuously absent or silenced. The Pope's list of accusations was a masterpiece of political rhetoric designed to shock and horrify the assembly. He accused Frederick of not just broken promises, but of outright heresy, of denying the immortality of the soul, of blaspheming against the sacraments, and of claiming that the world had been deceived by three impostors, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. He charged him with tyranny for crushing the liberties of the Church in his Italian domains, seizing church property, and imprisoning prelates. He even accused him of making peace with the Muslim Sultan of Egypt, portraying a strategic diplomatic achievement as an act of treachery against all Christendom. The outcome was a foregone conclusion, a carefully orchestrated spectacle of condemnation. After hearing the charges, the Council Fathers, acting as both jury and witnesses, unanimously declared Frederick Roman II deposed. They stripped him of his imperial title and all his kingdoms, absolving his subjects of their oaths of allegiance to him. In a final, dramatic act, Pope Innocent called for a new crusade, not against Muslims in the Holy Land, but against the now former emperor himself, offering the same spiritual indulgences to any Christian knight who would take up arms to unseat the deposed monarch. This was an unprecedented escalation, turning the crusading impulse inward and sanctifying a war of political overthrow. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Frederick, of course, utterly rejected the council's authority to depose him, and much of his empire, particularly in Germany and Italy, continued to support him. The deposition plunged the Holy Roman Empire into a bloody civil war that would last for decades after Frederick's death. But the long-term impact of the Council of Lyon was even more profound. It represented the most extreme assertion of papal supremacy over secular rulers in history. The high watermark of the medieval papacies claimed to hold the keys to political as well as spiritual power. It was a breathtaking gamble, a declaration that the Pope could unmake emperors. Yet, in its very extremism, it also revealed the limits of that power. The act was so shocking that it ultimately galvanized resistance, strengthening the arguments of those who believed that secular authority came from God and the people, not from the Pope. The struggle it intensified would eventually contribute to the weakening of both institutions, paving the way for the rise of the modern nation-state. The Council's other business, discussing aid for the crumbling Latin Empire of Constantinople and passing minor clerical reforms, was completely overshadowed by this earth-shattering act of political excommunication. The Council of Lyon stands as a stark monument to a world where the battle for ultimate authority was fought not with armies alone, but with decrees and depositions, where a meeting of bishops in a French cathedral believed it had the power to topple an emperor and redirect the course of history. Yet for all its grand ambition and meticulous planning, the Second Council of Lyon was built upon a foundation of profound desperation. The Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos was not driven by a sudden surge of ecumenical fervor, but by a chillingly pragmatic fear. His empire, the once mighty heir to Rome, had been reduced to a fragile rump state encircled by enemies. Most terrifying of all was the looming threat of Charles of Anjou, the ambitious brother of the French king, who had already seized Sicily and southern Italy and was openly plotting a full-scale invasion to conquer Constantinople itself and restore the Latin Empire that had been overthrown just 2 decades earlier. For Michael, union with the West was not a theological ideal. It was the only diplomatic lifeline left. He calculated that if he could secure the spiritual allegiance of the Pope, he could politically neutralize Charles, who would never dare attack a fellow Catholic prince under the direct protection of the Holy See. It was a breathtaking gamble, an attempt to trade theological conformity for military security. Pope Gregory X, a man of sincere piety and deep diplomatic skill, approached the council with a very different, though equally pressing, set of motives. He was haunted by the failure of recent crusades and was single-mindedly focused on launching a new, great expedition to reclaim Jerusalem. He knew such an endeavor required the full resources of a united Christendom, and that the schism with the East was a crippling spiritual and military weakness. Furthermore, he was a reformer, disgusted by the corruption and worldly distractions that had infected the clergy. He saw the council as a triple opportunity to heal the ancient schism, to rally a unified church for a new crusade, and to purge the clergy of its abuses. The stage was thus set for a high-stakes negotiation where both sides needed something the other could provide, but their ultimate goals were worlds apart. The theological negotiations were a delicate and intricate dance around 2 of the most explosive issues dividing the churches. The first was the filioque clause, the Latin word meaning, and from the Son, that had been inserted into the Nicene Creed in the West, stating that the Holy Spirit proceeded from both the Father and the Son. To the Eastern theologians, this was a unilateral and heretical alteration of a sacred, ecumenical creed that undermined the unique monarchy of God the Father. The second, even more contentious issue was the claim of papal primacy. The East honored the Pope as the first among equals, the patriarch of the elder Rome. But the West now insisted on a much stronger definition, that the Pope held supreme, immediate, and universal jurisdiction over the entire Church, including the Eastern patriarchs. After intense and fraught discussions, a compromise formula was painfully hammered out. On the filioque, the Greeks were essentially asked to accept the Latin doctrine as theologically valid, though they would not be required to insert the word into their own Greek liturgy. On the papacy, they assented to a vague recognition of the Roman pontiff's primacy, including the right to provide pallium's ceremonial vestments to the Eastern patriarchs, a symbol of their communion with and subordination to Rome. On July 6, 1274, in the Cathedral of St. John in Lyon, the union was officially proclaimed. It was a moment of historic, tearful solemnity. The papal choir sang the creed in Greek and Latin, including the contested filioque. The Greek delegates, following their emperor's strict orders, assented to the decrees. Messages of joy were sent throughout Europe, heralding the end of the Great Schism. Pope Gregory had his unified Christendom, and Emperor Michael had his crucial political shield. But this magnificent edifice of unity was a palace built on sand. The agreement had been engineered by emperors and popes, but it had utterly failed to win the hearts of the Byzantine people, clergy, and monks. Back in Constantinople, the news was met not with celebration, but with outrage and mourning. The vast majority of Byzantines saw the union not as a healing, but as a humiliating surrender to Latin heresy and a betrayal of their ancient faith. They contemptuously referred to Emperor Michael as a new Judas. Prominent bishops and abbots led the resistance, refusing to commemorate the Pope in their liturgies. The union became a deeply unpopular and divisive political liability within the empire, a source of civil unrest that weakened Michael's dynasty rather than strengthening it. The death of both principal architects, Pope Gregory in 1276 and Emperor Michael in 1282, shattered the fragile agreement. The new Byzantine emperor, Andronikos II, bowing to overwhelming public and clerical pressure, formally repudiated the Union of Lyon, and the schism snapped back into place, deeper and more permanent than before. The Council's other achievements, including important reforms against clerical simony and neglect, and the plans for a new crusade, were all swept away in the wake of this failure. The Second Council of Lyon stands as a poignant lesson in the limits of high-level diplomacy. It demonstrated that a true meeting of churches cannot be imposed by rulers seeking political advantage, or even by well-meaning theologians drafting precise formulas. Real unity requires the consent of the faithful, a shared sense of belonging that transcends political calculation. It was a magnificent, well-intentioned failure whose collapse ensured that the rift between East and West would become a permanent feature of the Christian world, a divide that would shape the religious and cultural geography of Europe for the next 7 centuries. Pope Clement V journeyed to the Council of Vienne in 1311, a deeply compromised and conflicted man. The first pope to reign from Avignon rather than Rome, he was effectively a client of the powerful and ruthless King Philip IV of France, residing under the shadow of the French crown. The immense, echoing hall where the council convened was filled not with the spirit of free theological inquiry, but with the palpable, heavy pressure of royal demand. The primary item on the agenda, forced upon the Church by Philip, was the utter destruction of one of its most powerful and wealthy institutions, the Knights Templar. This would not be a dispassionate examination of evidence, but a brutal exercise in realpolitik, a stark demonstration of how a secular king could bend the highest authority of the Church to his will for reasons of greed and fear. King Philip's motives were as financial as they were political. He was bankrupt from his wars with England and Flanders, and his eyes had long been fixed on the immense wealth of the Knights Templar. The order was not just a band of warrior monks, it was the preeminent international banking network of its day, safeguarding the treasures of kings and commoners alike in its fortified temples. Philip himself was deeply in their debt. Furthermore, he feared their power. They were an army within his kingdom, owing ultimate allegiance only to the Pope, a state within a state that his absolutist ambitions could not tolerate. To seize their wealth and eliminate this threat, he launched a devastatingly efficient smear campaign. On a single-day Friday, October 13, 1307, he ordered the simultaneous arrest of every Templar in France on charges so sensational they would dominate the medieval equivalent of the front page: heresy, idolatry, sodomy, and spitting on the cross. The confessions he needed were extracted through horrific torture, creating the evidence he would then present to a horrified and pliable Pope. Pope Clement was trapped. He knew the charges were almost certainly fabricated, the product of brutal coercion. He initially tried to resist, but Philip's agents skillfully manipulated public opinion and threatened to try the Templars himself in a secular court, which would have been an even greater humiliation for the papacy. Cornered, Clement agreed to convene the Council of Vienne to settle the matter with the appearance of ecclesiastical due process. The proceedings were a sham. Though many bishops were deeply skeptical of the charges, King Philip surrounded the city with his army, a not-so-subtle reminder of the consequences of defiance. When a significant number of Templars arrived to passionately defend their order and recount the confessions torn from them under torture, Philip's ministers intervened, pressuring Clement to prevent them from speaking. The Pope, fearing schism and possibly his own deposition, capitulated. Without a formal vote or a genuine doctrinal condemnation, he issued the bull Vox in Excelso, suppressing the order of the Knights Templar, citing not their guilt but the scandal and infamy that now surrounded them, a legal fiction to justify an act of raw political annihilation. The Council's other major deliberations provided a stark contrast to this grim political theater, delving into the passionate and nuanced spiritual debates within the Franciscan order. A radical faction, known as the Spirituals, insisted on a literal, absolute adherence to St. Francis's vow of poverty, arguing that Christ and his apostles had owned nothing individually or in common. This zealous stand brought them into direct conflict with the mainstream of the order and the papal hierarchy, which viewed such extremism as destabilizing and practically unworkable for a large international institution. The Council, seeking a middle ground, attempted to navigate this ideological minefield. It condemned the most extreme spiritual interpretations as heretical, but it also issued the decree Exivi de Paradiso, which praised the ideal of Franciscan poverty while trying to regulate its practice. This attempt at compromise ultimately failed to satisfy the zealots, and the persecution of the Spirituals would continue, their fervent call for apostolic purity becoming a rallying cry for later reform movements that would challenge the Church for centuries to come. Finally, reflecting the papacy's ongoing preoccupation with the loss of the Holy Land, the Council paid lip service to the call for a new crusade. It discussed plans and tithes, but these pronouncements rang hollow in the shadow of the Templar affair. How could the Church hope to rally Christendom for a sacred war abroad when it had just allowed its most famous crusading order to be dismantled by a greedy king at home? The Council of Vienne closed not with a sense of triumphant reform, but with the weary air of an institution that had lost its moral compass. Its most enduring legacy was not a theological definition or a spiritual renewal, but the birth of a legend. The sudden dissolution of such a powerful and secretive order, combined with the rumor that their last Grand Master had cursed the king and pope from his burning stake, created a vacuum filled by mystery. Stories proliferated of hidden treasures, lost relics like the Holy Grail, and secret societies carrying on the Templar legacy in the shadows. This council, born of coercion and fear, thus accidentally gave rise to one of history's most potent and enduring conspiracy theories, a testament to how the cynical machinations of power can sometimes generate myths far more powerful than the truth they sought to suppress. For nearly 40 years, the very foundation of Western Christendom had been cracked down the middle. This was the Great Western Schism, a bewildering and demoralizing period where not two, but three rival popes each claimed to be the one true vicar of Christ, each with his own college of cardinals, his own curia, and his own network of political allies. Nations were forced to choose sides based on political expediency rather than spiritual truth. France backed the Pope in Avignon, England, and much of the Holy Roman Empire supported the one in Rome, and a third contender in Pisa complicated the scene further. The faithful were left in a state of agonizing confusion. If the Pope was the guarantor of salvation, who held the keys to heaven, which sacraments were valid? The constant stream of rival excommunications and anathemas created a spiritual crisis that eroded the very credibility of the Church, making a mockery of its claim to be the one, holy, and universal body of Christ. The chaos was so profound that it seemed no single pope could possibly clean up the mess, because each man's very claim to the office was the heart of the problem. Into this impossible situation stepped the Council of Constance, a gathering of breathtaking scale and ambition that would meet for 4 long years in a German city on the shores of Lake Constance. Its primary mission was clear to all: to end the schism and restore a single, unquestioned head to the Church. But to do that, it had to solve an unprecedented constitutional crisis. Who had the authority to judge and, if necessary, depose a pope? The Council Fathers, drawing on ideas that had been simmering since the Council of Pisa a century earlier, made a radical and revolutionary claim. They declared that in a state of emergency, the supreme authority in the Church resided not in the Pope, but in a general council representing the entire body of the faithful. This principle, known as conciliarism, was their legal and theological tool for the daunting task ahead. It gave them the authority to demand that all 3 rival popes, John XXIII in Pisa, Gregory XII in Rome, and Benedict XIII in Avignon, abdicate their claims for the good of the universal Church. What followed was a masterclass in high-stakes diplomacy, pressure, and political maneuvering. Pope John XXIII, who had initially convened the council, fled the city in disguise when he realized the fathers were serious about deposition, hoping to sabotage the entire process. The council, undeterred, simply continued without him, formally deposing him for his misconduct. The Roman claimant, Gregory XII, took a more dignified path. In a carefully orchestrated move, he agreed to resign voluntarily, but only after he was allowed to formally reconvene the council under his own authority, thus preserving the technical legitimacy of the papal line before surrendering it. The Avignon Pope, Benedict XIII, proved the most stubborn, retreating to a fortress in Spain and refusing to budge, but his support dwindled away as the rest of Christendom moved on. With a path finally cleared, the Council's electoral college, which included not just cardinals but also representatives from the 5 great nations present, elected a new, universally accepted pope in November 1417. The man chosen was Otto Colonna, who took the name Martin V. His election was met with an explosion of joy and relief across Europe. The Great Schism was finally over. Yet, even as it achieved its glorious primary goal, the Council of Constance was conducting another, far darker proceeding that would cast a long shadow over the future. Among the many reformers who came to Constance to present their visions for renewing the Church was a fiery Czech preacher and rector of Prague University, Jan Hus. Inspired by the English reformer John Wycliffe, whose had been railing against the moral corruption and wealth of the clergy, advocating for a church that returned to the poverty and simplicity of the Gospels. He also championed the radical idea that the ultimate authority for a Christian was not the Pope, but the Scripture itself, a belief that directly challenged the entire hierarchical structure of the medieval church. He had come to Constance under a promise of safe conduct from Emperor Sigismund, eager to defend his views before the council. That promise was brutally broken. Despite the imperial guarantee, Hus was almost immediately arrested and thrown into a dungeon. The council fathers saw in him not a sincere reformer, but a dangerous heretic whose ideas, if allowed to spread, could unravel the very fabric of Christendom. His teachings on the authority of Scripture threatened the power of the clergy. His attacks on clerical wealth undermined the Church's financial base. His popularity among the Czech commoners smelled of social revolution. The council put him on trial, less to engage with his ideas and more to force him to recant. Hus, a man of deep conscience, refused to abjure beliefs he felt were grounded in Scripture. The council found him guilty of heresy, stripped him of his priesthood, and handed him over to the secular authorities for punishment. On July 6, 1415, Jan Hus was burned at the stake, his body consumed by fire and his ashes scattered in the Rhine River to prevent any relics from being venerated. In that single, fiery act, the council achieved unity but sacrificed its moral authority in the eyes of many. It had successfully ended the schism by deposing popes, but it had also shown itself willing to burn a man for challenging clerical authority. For the people of Bohemia, Hus's execution was not a righteous act of justice but a martyrdom, a betrayal that ignited a firestorm of national and religious outrage. The Hussite wars that followed would rage for decades, the first of the great religious wars that would later engulf Europe. Furthermore, the Council's triumphant assertion of conciliar authority, the very tool it used to heal the schism, would soon be overturned. Once Pope Martin V was securely on the throne, the papacy moved quickly to reassert its absolute supremacy, condemning the idea that a council was above a pope. The Council of Constance thus stands as a profound paradox, a meeting that brilliantly solved an immediate crisis through collective action, but in doing so, both unleashed the forces of violent revolution in Bohemia and triggered a papal backlash that would stifle meaningful reform for another century, leaving the deeper grievances to fester until they exploded in the Reformation. Imagine a council so sprawling and so ambitious that it could not be contained by a single city, its proceedings stretching across 18 years and migrating from the Swiss Alps to the sun-drenched Piazzas of Italy. This was the Council of Basel-Ferrara-Florence, the last, greatest, and ultimately most heartbreaking attempt to heal the ancient schism that had torn Christendom in two. It began in 1431 in the imperial city of Basel, buzzing with the revolutionary energy of conciliarism, the powerful idea that a general council of bishops held supreme authority over the entire church, even the Pope. The fathers at Basel, many of them fiery reformers, were determined to tackle the twin crises facing the church, the persistent divide with the East and the desperate need for internal reform. But they immediately locked horns with a man who had no intention of being sidelined, the new Pope, Eugene IV. Pope Eugene viewed the council at Basel with deep suspicion. He saw it not as a partner in reform, but as a rival power base intent on shackling papal authority. In a bold move to reassert control, he attempted to dissolve the council just a year after it began. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The council fathers, emboldened by the precedent set at Constance, simply refused to disband. They declared that a pope could not dissolve a council without its own consent, and they continued their work, effectively staging a revolt against Eugene himself. This set the stage for a surreal and unprecedented situation. A council that was supposed to represent a unified church was now itself schismatic, with one faction loyal to the council in Basel and another loyal to the Pope in Rome. This internal power struggle threatened to render the entire project meaningless before it had even addressed its primary goal. Amid this tumultuous standoff, a window of opportunity suddenly opened in the east. The Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaiologos was facing an existential threat. The Ottoman Turks were tightening their noose around Constantinople, and the once great empire had been reduced to little more than the city itself and a fragment of the Peloponnese. In sheer desperation, the emperor made a staggering offer. He was willing to discuss the reunion of the Eastern and Western churches to end the schism that had lasted for centuries in exchange for military aid from the West against the Ottoman onslaught. For the Byzantines, this was a painful, pragmatic decision driven by the direst necessity, not a sudden conversion to Latin theology. For Pope Eugene, it was a divine opportunity to achieve a historic triumph and outmaneuver his rivals in Basel. He invited the Byzantine delegation to meet with him, and the council, recognizing the immense importance of these talks, agreed to transfer its operations to Italy, first to Ferrara and later to Florence, to be closer to the seat of papal power and to accommodate the Byzantine delegation. What followed was one of the most extraordinary summits in history. The city of Ferrara, and later Florence, was transformed into a stage for high-stakes theological diplomacy. The Byzantine delegation was immense, comprising the emperor himself, his patriarch, and hundreds of bishops, theologians, and scholars. They were housed, fed, and funded at great expense by the Pope and the wealthy Medici family, who saw the event as a magnificent opportunity to burnish Florence's prestige. For months, the finest minds of East and West engaged in intense, often agonizingly detailed debates over the very issues that had divided them for centuries. The central sticking points were, as always, the papal claim to universal jurisdiction and the filioque clause in the Creed. The Eastern bishops could not accept the Pope as the absolute monarch of the entire Church, and they viewed the addition of the filioque as a unilateral and heretical alteration of the sacred creed. The negotiations were a grueling marathon of intellectual and political persuasion. The Western side, led by brilliant theologians, argued their case with logic and citations from the Church Fathers. The Greeks, heirs to a profound mystical tradition, held their ground with equal passion. The discussions went in circles for weeks. The real breakthrough came not from a sudden theological revelation, but from the relentless pressure of the Byzantine emperor's desperate circumstances. With the Turkish threat looming ever larger and the hope of a crusading army dangling before him, John VIII essentially forced his reluctant clergy to accept a compromise. The formula they finally agreed upon was a masterpiece of careful wording. On the papacy, they acknowledged the Pope as the successor of Peter and the first among patriarchs, with the right to govern the universal church, but the precise extent of his immediate jurisdiction was left somewhat ambiguous. On the filioque, the Greeks agreed that the doctrine behind the word that the Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son was theologically sound, and they accepted the Latin use of the term, though they would not be required to insert it into their Greek liturgy. In July 1439, in the magnificent Duomo of Florence, the decree of union was solemnly signed. The lofty vaults of the cathedral echoed with the singing of the Creed in both Greek and Latin. There were tearful embraces and declarations that the wall of separation had finally been torn down. Pope Eugene had his magnificent victory, and Emperor John had his promised treaty of military support. It was the crowning achievement of medieval ecumenism, a moment of unparalleled hope. Yet that hope was incredibly fragile. The agreement had been forged not in the hearts of the faithful, but in the halls of power under the shadow of an impending invasion. When the emperor and his delegation returned home to Constantinople, they were met not with celebration, but with a firestorm of popular outrage. The clergy, the monks, and the common people saw the union of Florence not as a reconciliation, but as a humiliating surrender, a betrayal of their ancient faith to secure political favors from the Latins. The churches of Constantinople erupted in protest. Many of the bishops who had signed the decree in Florence publicly renounced it upon returning home. The union was dead on arrival, rejected by the very people it was meant to unite. The military aid from the West, when it finally arrived, was too little, too late. A defeated Crusader army was wiped out at Varna in 1444. Less than a decade after the triumphant signing in Florence, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, its last emperor dying on the walls. The Council of Basel-Ferrara-Florence stands as a poignant and tragic lesson in the limits of high diplomacy. It proved that a true meeting of faith and culture cannot be imposed from above through intricate theological formulas or political deals. Real unity requires a meeting of hearts, a shared spirit that no decree, no matter how elegantly written, can ever mandate. While the great councils of the 15th century wrestled with reuniting East and West, a very different kind of assembly was convening on the Iberian Peninsula, one that would wield unity not as an ecumenical ideal, but as a weapon of state. The year was 1476, and the setting was the ancient Visigothic capital of Toledo. But this was not a gathering called by a pope or an emperor. It was a meticulously orchestrated national council summoned by the Catholic monarchs themselves, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Their recent marriage had politically united Spain's two most powerful kingdoms, and they were now embarked on an audacious project to forge a single, homogeneous, and unquestionably Catholic nation from the diverse tapestry of cultures that had characterized medieval Spain for centuries. The Council of Toledo was a critical tool in this project, a moment where the machinery of the Church was explicitly harnessed to serve the ambitions of the Crown, setting in motion a chain of events that would define Spain for centuries and cast a long, dark shadow over its history. The Council's primary focus, and its most fateful decision, was to formally petition Pope Sixtus IV for a bull authorizing the establishment of a new Inquisition, one that would be unlike any other in Europe. Previous Inquisitions had been under papal control, answering to Rome. The Spanish Inquisition, as conceived by Ferdinand and Isabella, would be a royal institution, its inquisitors appointed by and reporting directly to the Crown. This was a breathtaking consolidation of power, merging religious authority with state control to an unprecedented degree. The official target was a specific and growing segment of the population, the conversos, or new Christians, Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under intense social pressure or the threat of violence during pogroms in the late 14th century. Many of these families had been Christian for generations and had risen to positions of great wealth, influence, and education within Spanish society. This very success bred resentment among the old Christian populace, who whispered of crypto-Judaism as secretly practicing Jewish rites in the privacy of their homes. The Council gave official theological sanction to these suspicions, framing the issue not as one of social jealousy, but as a dire threat to the purity of the faith and the soul of the nation itself. The decrees that flowed from Toledo were not merely about establishing an inquisitorial body. They were about creating a legal and social framework for persecution. The Council reinforced and codified a series of viciously anti-Jewish statutes known as the Estatutos de Limpieza de Sangre, the Statutes of Blood Purity. These laws went beyond policing belief. They policed bloodlines. They prohibited anyone with Jewish ancestry, even distant, from holding public office, entering universities, or joining prestigious military and religious orders. Your faith no longer mattered, your genealogy was your destiny. This created a permanent, hereditary underclass based on ancestry rather than belief, institutionalizing racism within a Christian framework generations before the concept would take root in the modern world. The Council's canons also enforced strict social segregation, limiting interactions between old and new Christians and further fanning the flames of suspicion and alienation. The approval from Rome was granted, and the Spanish Inquisition began its work with terrifying efficiency under the leadership of the notorious Tomás de Torquemada. Its methods were brutal: secret accusations, anonymous denunciations, the use of torture to extract confessions, and the grand public spectacles of punishment known as autos da fe, acts of faith. Its goal was not just to punish individuals but to serve as a terrifying public theater that would compel absolute conformity. The success of the Inquisition, blessed by the Council of Toledo, created a powerful momentum that made the next logical step seem inevitable. If the presence of Jews in society was seen as a temptation that led conversos to backslide into heresy, then the solution was not just to monitor the converts, but to remove the source of the temptation altogether. This chilling logic culminated in the Alhambra Decree of 1492, which ordered the expulsion of all Jews from Spain. Over 100,000 people were given an impossible choice: convert to Christianity or abandon the only home they had ever known, leaving behind their property and their heritage. This act of ethnic and religious cleansing was the direct, horrifying fulfillment of the ideology formalized at Toledo 16 years earlier. The Council had provided the theological and legal justification for defining Spanish identity in the most exclusionary terms possible, proving that a meeting of bishops could do more than define doctrine. It could unleash a state-sanctioned machine of fear that would reshape a nation's very soul. Yet, even as Spain was turning inward, defining itself through exclusion, the sprawling and fragmented Holy Roman Empire was facing a very different challenge: how to hold itself together. In 1495, the ancient Rhineland city of Worms became the stage for a pivotal gathering that defies easy categorization. This was the Diet of Worms, an assembly that, while primarily a meeting of the empire's secular estates, was deeply infused with the presence and influence of its ecclesiastical princes. This blend of the sacred and the temporal was the very essence of the empire's complex identity, and the reforms enacted here were a desperate attempt to modernize a medieval structure creaking under the weight of its own contradictions and facing a terrifying new external threat from the rising Ottoman Empire. The man at the center of this effort was the young king of the Romans, Maximilian I of the Habsburg dynasty. He was a visionary ruler, a man of the dawning Renaissance who understood that the old, feudal ways of governing were no longer sufficient. His empire was a bewildering patchwork of over 1,000 semi-independent territories, powerful prince-bishoprics, ambitious dukes, free imperial cities, and petty knights, all fiercely protective of their ancient liberties and privileges. There was no standing army, no centralized treasury, and no reliable system of justice that could override local courts. This chronic decentralization made the empire notoriously slow to react, politically paralyzed, and vulnerable to both internal squabbles and external enemies. Maximilian's grand ambition was to forge order from this chaos, to create institutions that could bind these disparate parts into a more cohesive and effective whole. The Diet of Worms was his opportunity to persuade the empire's powerful estates to willingly surrender a measure of their autonomy for the greater good and security of all. The crowning achievement of this Diet, and its most lasting legacy, was the establishment of the Reichskammergericht, the imperial chamber court. This was a revolutionary judicial body. For the first time, the empire would have a permanent, supreme court that was not just an extension of the emperor's personal will. Its judges were to be a PPOINTED Chinese letter by the Emperor, a ND Chinese letter by the Imperial Estates, a delicate balance designed to ensure its independence and fairness. Its jurisdiction extended across the entire empire, and it was empowered to hear appeals from lower courts and to adjudicate disputes between the various princes and cities. This was a monumental step toward the rule of law. It offered every subject of the empire, at least in theory, a path to justice that transcended the whim of their local lord. It promised to replace the arbitrary justice of the strong with the impartial judgment of a legal process, creating a common standard of justice that could help foster a genuine sense of imperial unity and citizenship. The creation of this court represented a profound shift from a purely personal, feudal governance to the beginnings of an institutional, state-based system. But building a new court and maintaining its authority required money, and this led to the Diet's second major innovation, the Gemina Pfennig, or common penny. This was a groundbreaking, empire-wide head tax levied on every subject over the age of 15. Unlike traditional feudal obligations, which were paid in kind or through military service by vassals to their immediate lords, this was a universal cash tax paid directly to the imperial institutions. Its primary purpose was to fund the new imperial chamber court and, just as importantly, to finance a standing imperial army, Reichsarmee, to defend the empire's borders. The need for this army was terrifyingly immediate. The Ottoman Empire, under the aggressive Sultan Bayezid II, was advancing relentlessly through the Balkans, threatening the empire's southeastern flank. The common penny was therefore not just a tax for administrative reform. It was explicitly framed as a necessary contribution to a holy defense of Christendom itself. This seamlessly blended the practical needs of state building with the powerful rhetoric of a crusade, making the financial demand palatable to a population conditioned to contribute to religious causes. The Diet of Worms, therefore, stands as a brilliant example of a hybrid assembly, a meeting where the lines between a secular parliament and a religious council were beautifully and necessarily blurred. The ecclesiastical princes in attendance were not mere observers. They were vital power brokers whose support was essential for passing these reforms, and their own territorial interests were directly affected by the new court and the new tax. The gathering's agenda reflected a world where the defense of the faith and the defense of the realm were one and the same. While the reforms of 1495 only achieved partial success, the common penny proved difficult to collect and was later replaced by other systems. The imperial chamber court endured for over 3 centuries, becoming a cornerstone of the German legal tradition. This diet captures a pivotal moment of transition where the medieval empire, confronted with the twin pressures of internal disorder and external menace, began its long, slow, and often awkward evolution toward a more modern state. Yet, even as the Diet of Worms was attempting to fortify the Holy Roman Empire with new legal and financial structures, a far more ominous storm was gathering just beneath the surface of European society, a storm of spiritual discontent that the Church in Rome seemed tragically ill-equipped to weather. The Fifth Lateran Council, which concluded in 1517 after 5 long years of deliberation, was meant to be the Church's grand answer to the rising chorus of calls for reform. Instead, it became history's most poignant lesson in the dangers of too little, too late. Convened by the warrior Pope Julius II, a man more famed for his patronage of Michelangelo and his military campaigns to reclaim papal lands than for his personal piety, the council's very inception was mired in politics. Julius called it primarily to outmaneuver a rival council schismatically convened by King Louis XII of France, aiming to reassert papal supremacy rather than from a pure desire for spiritual renewal. From the outset, the council's tone was defensive and self-congratulatory rather than penitent and transformative. it did, to its credit, acknowledge some of the glaring abuses rotting the Church from within. It issued thoughtful decrees on the urgent need for better educated clergy, mandating that bishops establish schools for priestly training and that preachers be properly licensed to ensure they taught sound doctrine. It condemned the worst excesses of the printing press, which was already spreading radical and unapproved ideas, and it even placed restrictions on the often outlandish prophecies of apocalyptic preachers who were terrifying the populace. In a move that acknowledged the Church's global mission, it promoted plans for a new crusade against the Ottomans and discussed the evangelization of the New World, which was just opening up to European exploration. On the surface, it was a robust agenda for renewal, but the Council's efforts were like applying a fresh coat of paint to a building with a crumbling foundation. It brilliantly and forcefully attacked the symptoms of the disease while completely ignoring the cancerous tumors at the core. The most glaring silence was on the issue of simony, the buying and selling of church offices, which was rampant and turned bishoprics and cardinalates into commodities for wealthy, ambitious families rather than spiritual posts for shepherds of souls. Even more critically, the Council said absolutely nothing about the explosive traffic in indulgences. This practice, which offered remission from the temporal punishment of sin in exchange for monetary contributions to church projects, was becoming a vast and spiritually corrosive fundraising scheme. It created a perception that God's grace could be purchased, reducing salvation to a financial transaction and alienating countless devout Christians who yearned for a faith based on genuine repentance and inner transformation. Most fatally, the Fifth Lateran Council doubled down on the very ideology that had prevented meaningful change for a century, the absolute supremacy of the papal monarchy. In its 8th session, it issued the bull Pasta Aeternus, which forcefully condemned the conciliarist ideas that had flourished during the Great Schism. It declared that general councils derived their authority solely from the Pope, and that no council could ever claim to be above a reigning pontiff. This was a definitive slamming of the door on the most powerful mechanism for internal reform the Church had ever developed. By shutting down the possibility that a council could correct a wayward pope, it concentrated all power in an office that was itself often corrupt and politically entangled. It was a triumph of centralized control over collective wisdom, of institutional self-preservation over humble self-examination. The council closed in March 1517 with Pope Leo X, a Medici prince known for his lavish patronage and worldly tastes, declaring that the work of reform was now complete. Yet just 7 months later, in a university town in distant Germany, an Augustinian monk and theology professor named Martin Luther, despairing of the Church's inability to reform itself from within, would nail his 95 theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. His protest was initially a scholarly challenge to debate the abuse of indulgences, the very issue the Fifth Lateran Council had refused to even mention. The Church's failure to adequately address its deepest wounds at this critical juncture did not just miss an opportunity to prevent a schism, it actively created the conditions for one. The Council's timid, top-down reforms proved to a generation of disillusioned believers that the institution was incapable of healing itself, making Luther's radical call for a return to Scripture alone seem not like rebellion, but like the only logical path left for a soul seeking salvation. The Fifth Lateran Council stands as a tragic monument to institutional myopia, a gathering that had every tool at its disposal to steer the Church toward renewal, but chose instead to rearrange the deck chairs on a ship that was already heading straight for the rocks. Yet even as the Fifth Lateran Council was reinforcing the very structures that would soon be challenged, a different kind of meeting was taking place in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, that would prove far more consequential for the future of Western Christianity. The Diet of Speyer in 1526 was not a church council called by a pope, but an imperial diet convened by the secular ruler, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, acting on behalf of his brother, Emperor Charles V. The atmosphere was one of weary, pragmatic exhaustion. Just 5 years earlier, at the Diet of Worms, Charles had issued a definitive edict declaring Martin Luther an outlaw and a heretic, banning his writings and ordering his arrest. That edict, however, had proven utterly unenforceable. The Reformation was no longer a single monk's protest. It was a wildfire of popular piety, theological conviction, and political ambition that had already taken root in powerful territories across Germany. Trying to crush it by imperial fiat now risked tearing the entire empire apart in a catastrophic civil war. The primary item on the agenda at Speyer was not theology, but money. Emperor Charles was desperately in need of military and financial support from the German princes to fight a new war against the Ottoman Turks, who were threatening the empire's eastern borders. The Lutheran princes, led by the formidable Philip of Hesse and the Elector John of Saxony, saw their leverage and seized it. They made it clear that their cooperation and their financial contributions were contingent on a fundamental concession: the suspension of the Edict of Worms. They argued with compelling logic that a religious settlement could not be forced upon the empire while its head was absent, and while the promised General Council to address the Church's problems, a council that had been talked about for over a decade, had still not materialized. In the face of this political reality, Ferdinand and the Catholic princes were forced to compromise. The resulting recess or decree of the Diet was a masterpiece of political ambiguity that would change the course of history. It did not officially endorse Lutheranism or repeal the Edict of Worms. Instead, it declared that until a general council of the Church could be convened, each estate of the empire should, in matters concerning the Edict of Worms, so live, govern, and carry itself as it hopes and trusts to answer to God and His Imperial Majesty. This carefully crafted legal phrasing was a bombshell. In practice, it granted every prince and free imperial city the right to choose whether to enforce the anti-Lutheran edict within their own borders. It was the birth of the revolutionary principle of cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion, although it would not be formally named as such for another 30 years. The immediate effect was the legalization of religious pluralism, not for individuals but for entire territories. Princes who had already embraced Lutheranism now had a temporary but official imperial sanction to organize their own territorial churches, seize Catholic properties, and reform worship without fear of immediate imperial punishment. Cities like Strasbourg and Nuremberg could officially become Protestant strongholds. The Diet of Speyer had effectively decentralized religious decision-making, transforming the spiritual unity of Christendom into a patchwork of local options determined by the conscience of the ruler. This was a staggering blow to the ideal of a single, universal Catholic Church and a monumental victory for the Reformation, granting it the breathing room and political legitimacy it needed to become a permanent fixture on the European landscape. But the Diet's compromise was inherently unstable, intended only as a temporary stopgap. When a subsequent Diet of Speyer in 1529 attempted to revoke this toleration and reassert the full force of the Edict of Worms, the Lutheran princes issued a formal protestatio, from which the term Protestant derived. This act of defiance, made possible by the legal footing they had gained in 1526, made a military conflict between the Protestant Schmalkaldic League and the Catholic Emperor almost inevitable. The religious peace that finally ended these wars, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, did not create a new system but merely made permanent the temporary solution first invented at Speyer. The Diet's genius was in its pragmatic recognition of a truth that ideologues on both sides refused to admit, that sometimes to preserve the peace of a community, the most powerful thing a governing body can do is not to enforce a single truth, but to legally accommodate a disagreement, allowing time and local choice to shape a new, more complex reality. If the Diet of Speyer had granted Protestantism a legal foothold and the Fifth Lateran Council had proven the Old Guard's inability to reform, then the Council of Trent was the Catholic Church's monumental, defiant, and breathtakingly comprehensive answer. Convened in 3 sessions over 18 years from 1545 to 1563, this was not a gathering of compromise or ecumenical dialogue. It was a fortress council called to draw an unbreachable line around Catholic orthodoxy, to reform the Church from within on its own terms, and to launch a powerful counter-offensive against the Reformation, a movement that would come to be known as the Counter-Reformation. While its conclusion edges beyond the traditional medieval period, Trent was the direct, logical, and ultimate culmination of the medieval council tradition. It was the Old World's most sophisticated and forceful response to the New, using the ancient tools of conciliar authority to meet a modern crisis. The Council's work was monumental in its scope, and it began by slamming the door shut on any possibility of theological reconciliation with Protestant ideas. Where Luther had preached sola fide justification by faith alone, the Council Fathers at Trent articulated a more complex, synergistic view. They declared that while God's grace is the primary cause of salvation, human beings must freely cooperate with that grace through good works. Justification was not a one-time event, but an ongoing process. On the critical issue of authority, where reformers had insisted on sola scriptura, the Bible alone, as the source of religious truth, Trent firmly placed scripture and sacred tradition on equal footing, both flowing from the same divine wellspring and both entrusted to the teaching authority of the Church. This was a definitive rejection of private interpretation, centralizing doctrinal authority firmly in the hands of the magisterium, the Church's teaching office. Perhaps most fundamentally, the Council provided crystal-clear definitions on the 7 sacraments, affirming all of them as necessary channels of God's grace, and specifically reaffirming transubstantiation as the official explanation for the Eucharist. Every major doctrinal challenge of the Protestants was met not with adaptation, but with clarification and confirmation. But Trent was far more than a defensive bulwark. It was also a sweeping project of internal reform, addressing the very corruption and laxity that had fueled the Reformation in the first place. Understanding that a purified faith required a purified clergy, the Council issued decrees that transformed the Catholic priesthood. It mandated the establishment of seminaries in every diocese for the proper education and training of priests, ending the era of the ignorant and poorly formed clergymen. It required bishops to reside in their dioceses, putting an end to the scandal of absentee prelates who treated their bishoprics as mere sources of income while living luxuriously elsewhere. The Council cracked down on the selling of church offices or simony and banned the practice of pluralism where one man held multiple benefices. These reforms were designed to create a new kind of clergy, educated, disciplined, resident, and focused on their pastoral duties of preaching and administering the sacraments. This was the Church finally, belatedly, getting its own house in order. The Council's reach extended into the very rhythm and sensory experience of Catholic life. To ensure uniformity and orthodoxy in worship, it standardized the Roman Missal, the Breviary, and the Catechism. This meant that the Mass celebrated in a small village church in Portugal would be essentially identical to one offered in a grand cathedral in Poland. This liturgical uniformity became a powerful tool for reinforcing a shared Catholic identity across the globe. The Council's decrees also had a profound impact on art and culture, giving rise to the Baroque style. In response to the Protestant rejection of religious imagery as idolatrous, Trent vigorously endorsed the use of art in churches, insisting that paintings and sculptures were the Bible of the illiterate and could inspire the faithful toward greater piety. This directive led to an explosion of dramatic, emotional, and theatrically beautiful art designed to overwhelm the senses and stir the soul. Think of the soaring, luminous paintings of Caravaggio and the dynamic, twisting sculptures of Bernini. This was faith made visible, a stark contrast to the austere, word-centered worship of many Protestant communities. The Council of Trent's legacy is almost impossible to overstate. It created the modern Roman Catholic Church, ending centuries of medieval theological ambiguity and regional variation with a centralized, codified, and militant identity. It launched a spiritual and intellectual revival that produced new religious orders like the Jesuits, who became the shock troops of the Counter-Reformation through education and missionary work. It shaped Catholic education, devotion, and art for the next 400 years. While it closed the door on reconciliation with Protestantism, it successfully fortified its own walls, ensuring the survival and renewal of the Catholic faith as a powerful, global institution. In this sense, Trent was the last and greatest of the medieval councils, using ancient forms to meet a modern challenge, and in doing so, it defined the contours of the religious world we still live in today. While the Council of Trent was solidifying Catholic identity in the West, the Eastern Orthodox world found itself navigating a very different set of challenges. By the late 17th century, the Orthodox Church was no longer the state religion of a mighty empire, but a community living under Ottoman rule, its ancient patriarchates often struggling to maintain their authority and cohesion. Into this vulnerable landscape flowed a new set of ideas from the West, carried by Protestant merchants, Catholic missionaries, and the translated writings of Reformation theologians. These foreign concepts, challenges to tradition, questions about sacraments, and new interpretations of Scripture began to sow confusion and debate among the Orthodox faithful. How should the Church respond? The answer came not from an emperor, for there was none, but from a gathering that reached back to the oldest patterns of ecclesiastical life. In 1672, a great synod was convened in Jerusalem, a powerful demonstration that even without imperial power, the conciliar spirit of the medieval world was very much alive, ready to define and defend the faith once again. The immediate catalyst for the Synod of Jerusalem was the troubling activity of a former Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, Cyril Lucaris. A deeply complex and controversial figure, Lucaris had spent time in Protestant Switzerland and had grown fascinated with Reformed theology. In 1629, he published a confession of faith that sent shockwaves through the Orthodox world. Its contents were stunningly Protestant. It seemed to reject the real presence in the Eucharist, deny the existence of purgatory, and argue for predestination, all while recognizing Scripture alone as the source of authority. Although Lucaris later retracted it under pressure and was eventually executed by the Ottomans, the damage was done. His confession, widely circulated, had created a party of sympathizers and a deep crisis of identity. Was orthodoxy to be reformed along these new Western lines? The Synod of Jerusalem, presided over by Patriarch Dositheus of Jerusalem, was called explicitly to answer this question and to utterly repudiate the influence of Cyril Lucaris. The Council's primary work was the creation of a document known as the Confession of Dositheus. This was not a speculative exploration of new ideas, but a meticulous, point-by-point reaffirmation of traditional Orthodox doctrine, deliberately structured as a counter-confession to the one penned by Lucaris. Where Protestantism emphasized sola scriptura, the Council Fathers firmly placed Holy Tradition alongside Scripture as an equal source of divine revelation, both guided and interpreted by the authoritative teaching of the Church. This was a definitive statement that the faith was not a book to be privately interpreted, but a lived reality preserved and explained by the continuous witness of the apostolic community. On the critical question of the sacraments, which some Reformed thinkers had reduced to two, the Confession explicitly affirmed there are 7 holy mysteries, each a genuine channel of God's grace. It provided detailed definitions for each, from baptism and chrismation to matrimony and the Eucharist, leaving no room for doubt. The Council's statements on the Eucharist were particularly forceful and vivid. In direct opposition to symbolic or spiritualized interpretations, the Confession used the strongest possible language to affirm the doctrine of the real presence. It taught that after the consecration, the bread and wine are not merely symbols, but are truly and substantially changed into the very body and blood of Christ. To make this mystical transformation absolutely clear, it even adopted the Latin term transubstantiation, a rare instance of borrowing Western philosophical language to defend an Eastern truth. This was a clear line in the sand, distinguishing Orthodox belief not only from Protestant views but also from any lingering ambiguity within its own ranks. Furthermore, the Council affirmed the practice of praying for the dead and the veneration of icons and saints, practices that Reformed theology had fiercely attacked as idolatrous. Every point was a deliberate act of boundary-making, a declaration of what it meant to be Orthodox in a world filled with competing Christian voices. The significance of the Synod of Jerusalem extends far beyond its specific condemnations and affirmations. It stands as a powerful testament to the enduring resilience of the conciliar principle. With no Christian emperor to call or control a council, the Eastern Church proved it could still gather its leading bishops. The patriarchs of Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Antioch were present or represented, to collectively discern truth and exercise its teaching authority. This synod was the embodiment of the Church governing itself, a practice rooted in the earliest centuries and honed through the great ecumenical councils of the medieval era. It demonstrated that the need for clarity and self-definition did not end with the fall of Constantinople. It simply took on a new, more defensive character. The gathering in Jerusalem was not about ecumenical outreach or political maneuvering with empires. It was an act of spiritual consolidation, a firm closing of the ranks to protect a unique theological and spiritual identity from being diluted or absorbed by the powerful intellectual currents flowing from the West. In doing so, it ensured that the rich, mystical, and ancient faith of Eastern Orthodoxy would be preserved for future generations, not as a historical relic, but as a living tradition with clearly defined and passionately defended borders. What becomes truly astonishing is not just the individual decisions made in these 27 chambers, but the breathtaking cumulative effect they had in weaving the very fabric of the Western world. These were not isolated events. They were a sequence of intellectual and political earthquakes, each tremor building upon the last to reshape the entire landscape of human thought and society. They gave us the foundational language of our deepest beliefs, words like consubstantial from Nicaea and transubstantiation from Lateran concepts that have guided spiritual lives for nearly 2 millennia. They established the organizational blueprints for our institutions, from the diocese structure of the English Church born at Herford to the legal precedents for international justice first attempted at the Diet of Worms. These meetings literally drew the maps of nations, defining who belonged and who was an outsider, as the Council of Toledo did for Spain, and they set the borders between entire civilizations, as the failed union at Florence did for East and West. The very notion that a group of people could gather, debate complex ideas, and produce binding legislation for millions is a model of governance that these medieval councils helped pioneer and perfect, a legacy that echoes in every modern parliament and congress. They demonstrated, for better and often for worse, the immense power of a shared agreement, a collective yes or no that could alter the destiny of continents. Yet their legacy is a deeply complex one, a double-edged sword that cut paths toward both unity and persecution, toward enlightenment and profound darkness. The same councils that produced the magnificent theological balance of Chalcedon also produced the oppressive statutes of Toledo that fueled the Inquisition. The same gathering that ended the Great Schism at Constance also sent Jan Hus to the flames, igniting a different kind of fire in Bohemia. This is the essential, uncomfortable truth these meetings force us to confront, that the human impulse to define truth is inextricably linked with the urge to exclude those who disagree. The desire for clarity can harden into rigidity. The need for unity can become a mandate for conformity. The councils show us that the process of building a collective identity is often simultaneously an act of drawing a boundary and creating an other. They teach us that the tools of dialogue and debate are neutral. Their morality depends entirely on the hands that wield them. They can be used to craft a nuanced creed that embraces mystery or to draft a law that mandates a yellow badge. This paradox is their most enduring and challenging lesson. Perhaps the most compelling reason to remember these assemblies is not for their specific outcomes, but for the raw humanity they reveal. Strip away the theological jargon and the political maneuvering, and you find a room full of people ambitious, fearful, brilliant, stubborn, devout people wrestling with the biggest questions imaginable. What is the nature of reality? What is the purpose of authority? How do we live together in a community with shared values? These are not medieval questions, they are human questions. We see in the passionate arguments of an Athanasius or a Cyril of Alexandria the same fervent conviction that drives modern activists and thinkers. We see in the political calculations of a Charlemagne or a Philip IV the same play for power that defines boardrooms and capitals today. The settings have changed, the technology has advanced, but the fundamental dynamics of human collaboration and conflict remain eerily familiar. These councils hold up a mirror, showing us ourselves in elaborate robes and strange surroundings, reminding us that the struggles over identity, power, and belief are a permanent part of the human condition. Ultimately, the story of these 27 meetings is a powerful testament to the fact that history is not just shaped by battles and revolutions, by the roar of cannons and the charge of cavalry. It is also shaped in quiet rooms by the power of a well-made argument, the subtle influence of a whispered alliance, and the patient work of drafting a clause. The decisions made around those tables determined what an entire civilization believed, how it worshipped, how it governed itself, and how it treated its own people. They set in motion waves of consequence that would break on shores centuries later, influencing everything from art and architecture to law and international relations. Their story is a profound reminder that sometimes the most world-altering events are not loud and bloody, but quiet and deliberative. They challenge us to listen for the history that happens not on the battlefield, but in the meeting hall, and to recognize that our own conversations, debates, and collective decisions today are the councils that will shape the world of tomorrow. And so we return to where we began, not in a grand palace or on a bloody battlefield, but in a room where a handful of people, armed with nothing but words and their convictions, made choices that would cascade through the centuries to shape our present. These 27 councils were far more than historical footnotes. They were the architectural plans for the modern world, the moments where abstract ideas were hammered into the concrete realities of law, faith, and identity that we still live with today. They teach us a powerful, double-edged lesson about the nature of human progress, that the same collective deliberation that can produce a thing of breathtaking beauty, like the nuanced theological balance of the hypostatic union, can also be used to draft the brutal statutes that mandated the yellow badge. The urge to define truth is inextricably linked with the urge to exclude, and these meetings show that glorious unity for some almost always comes at the devastating cost of isolation for others. This paradox is their most enduring legacy. It challenges us to look at our own world and recognize the same forces at play in our boardrooms, our parliaments, and our online communities. The debates over religious tolerance that were ignited at Toledo and Constance are far from over. They simply play out today in discussions about immigration, pluralism, and how we build inclusive societies. The struggles over authority between central power and local autonomy, between institutions and individual conscience, that were fought between popes and emperors at Lyon and between concilarists and papalists at Basel, are the very same struggles we see in modern politics and corporate governance. The cultural identities that were forged in the fires of Whitby and Herford, defining what it meant to be English or Spanish, find their echo in today's conversations about national heritage and global citizenship. The past is not a foreign country, it is the foundation upon which we are still building. If this journey through these fateful conversations has shown us anything, it is that history is not a simple story of inevitable progress. It is a complex tapestry woven from countless decisions, each one closing certain doors while opening others. The courage of a Jan Hus or a Maximus the Confessor, standing alone against immense pressure, reminds us of the power of individual conscience. The political brilliance of a Charlemagne at Frankfurt or a Record at Toledo shows us how leadership can channel diverse energies toward a common purpose. And the tragic failures, like the forced union at Florence or the cynical destruction of the Templars at Vienne, stand as stark warnings of what happens when dialogue is corrupted by raw power and fear. These are not just medieval stories, they are human stories, and their lessons are ours to learn from. I hope this exploration has given you a new lens through which to see the world, a reminder that the most profound shifts often begin not with a bang, but with a debate. What conversations are we having today that will become the council meetings of tomorrow, the turning points that future historians will study? Your thoughts and reflections are what make this journey come alive, so please share them in the comments below. Let's start our own conversation. If you want to join us for more deep dives into the moments that made us who we are, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thank you for spending this time exploring the past with me. Remember, the next time you sit down in a meeting, no matter how ordinary it seems, you might